There is something that moves through the dark between the stars. It does not announce itself. It carries no banners. It sends no heralds ahead of it and issues no proclamations of intent. You will not find its name carved into the victory columns of your sector capital, and if you search the open Imperial records for evidence that it even exists, you will find almost nothing at all. Just the faintest shadow of a shadow. A few redacted lines in sealed inquisitorial archives. A partial name carved in relief on the walls of a Shrine World's crypt, the faces of the warriors depicted deliberately obscured beneath featureless discs of black obsidian, as though whoever commissioned the memorial wanted to acknowledge what those warriors had done without leaving any path for the curious to follow. That silence is not an accident. It is a warning. The Carcharodons Astra. In High Gothic, that name translates simply as the Star Sharks. In Low Gothic, spoken by the ordinary people of the Imperium who have had the misfortune of encountering them, they are called exactly that, the Space Sharks. And those who have survived that encounter, those rare, shell-shocked few who live to tell the tale, speak of what they witnessed in hushed voices, with the particular careful quietness of people who are afraid that if they speak too loudly, the things they are describing might hear them and come back. They wear gray armor, these warriors of the void. Armor that belongs to patterns from a different age, styles that predate most of the chapters that currently patrol the Imperium's borders by thousands of years. Their skin is the color of old bone or cold ash, a deathly pallor that sits wrong on any face, wrong in the way a light left burning in an empty house is wrong, suggesting something present without the warmth that should accompany presence. The older ones have eyes without iris or sclera, eyes that are simply black from corner to corner, solid pools of lightless dark that reflect nothing back at you when you look into them. As they age, their skin develops tiny, hard nodules arranged in rows across their bodies, a biological process without any recorded parallel in the Adeptus Astartes. That quiet biological detail that implies their genetic heritage might contain things even the Mechanicus cannot fully map or categorize. They move in silence, not just tactically, not just because silence is tactically advantageous, though it is. They move in silence the way deep ocean predators move in silence, because silence is their natural state, because the void they were born from does not produce sound, and after 10,000 years spent at the farthest edges of the galaxy and beyond, something of that silence has crept inside them and taken up permanent residence. They do not speak during battle. They do not cry out or shout oaths or roar battle hymns. They simply come and they kill, and the only sounds they produce are the impacts of weapons finding targets. When they enter a system, they do not identify themselves. Their ships run dark. No transponder signals, no communication bursts, no courtesy hails to system defense forces or nearby naval patrols. They simply appear. One moment the void is empty, and the next it isn't. And somewhere, on whatever world lies beneath their approach vector, someone with enough authority and enough information to know what those dark, silent ships mean is making very quick decisions about whether to cooperate or whether to attempt resistance. And if they have any genuine knowledge of the Carcharodons, they cooperate. Because resistance doesn't go well. The record of what happens to forces that try to stop the Carcharodons from doing what they came to do is not a record that encourages imitation. They are the Imperium's oldest secret weapon. They are the Executor's blade kept hidden behind the throne. They are the thing that other Space Marine chapters, warriors who have been genetically and psychologically engineered to feel no fear, find genuinely unsettling to be around. Because the Carcharodons are not performing darkness, they are not wearing darkness as a theatrical gesture, the way certain other chapters cultivate dark aesthetics for psychological effect. The darkness is real. The void has been their home for so long that they carry it with them wherever they go, and the things that live long enough in the dark without warmth or light or the company of other human beings tend to develop edges that could not have been anticipated when they were first placed in that darkness and told to stay there forever. This is their story, and it begins, as all the darkest stories do, with a question that cannot be fully answered. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where you all are around the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a good time, because we're going deep on the Space Sharks today, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Part 1. The origins, mystery, Raven Guard, Night Lords, or something older. The question of where the Carcharodons came from is genuinely one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in the entire lore of Warhammer 40,000. It is not that the answer is hidden behind a single piece of sealed information that just hasn't been released yet. It's that the evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, and every answer the evidence seems to suggest creates new, deeper questions that no available source can resolve. Start with what the Imperium itself officially records about them. In the open Imperial archives, there is essentially nothing. No founding date, no parent chapter, no homeworld, no battle honors. Not even a consistent name. The designation Carcharodons appears in some documents, Carcharodon Astra in others, Space Sharks in others still, and scattered across the historical record are references to formations called the Void Reapers and the Blood Sharks that may or may not be referring to the same warriors. Whatever filing system the Administratum uses to track the Space Marine chapters of the Imperium has essentially nothing useful to say about these particular Astartes, and that absence is itself meaningful, because the Administratum has a record for essentially everything, and when something is missing from those records, it usually means someone made the deliberate decision to remove it. The Inquisition's sealed archives offer slightly more. The oldest surviving reference to anything that might be the Carcharodons appears in a work called the Mythos Angelica Mortis, compiled by the savant scribes of the Secretariat Militum of Terra in the 35th millennium. This text is described as vague and incomplete, even by the standards of ancient imperial scholarship, but within its pages there are references to a Space Marine chapter designated the Carcharodon Astra. This would place the chapter's existence at least as far back as 12,000 years before the events of the Badab War, which is the campaign that first brought them to wider imperial attention. Whether this means they were founded in the earliest days after the Horus Heresy, or whether they existed even before that catastrophe reshuffled the entire structure of the Astartes, remains an open question. What the chapter's own legends say about their origin is carefully, deliberately obscured, even to those few outsiders who have managed to learn anything about their internal culture. They refer to a period they call the Day of Exile, a time when their wandering ancestors were cast out from wherever they came from and sent beyond the edge of the galaxy on a duty that was framed as sacred and everlasting. They speak of a figure called the Forgotten One, their unknown first chapter master or primogenitor, whose identity has been lost to the mists of their own history. They call the emperor by the name Rangu, which is understood to be related to Polynesian linguistic roots that somehow survived their 10,000 years of isolation in whatever form their cultural memory takes. And they continue to serve, generation after generation, in a darkness that never ends, waiting for a return that their oldest beliefs promise will one day come. Now look at the physical evidence. The handful of times that Deathwatch apothecaries, or other parties, have managed to study Carcharodon gene seed, they have found markers that are characteristic of the Raven Guard bloodline. The Raven Guard are themselves a chapter defined by their primary legion, the 19th Legion of the Astartes, led by the Primarch Corvus Corax. The genetic connection exists. It is not a strong connection, which in itself suggests significant genetic drift over an enormous span of time, but the markers are there. The physical appearance of the Carcharodons reinforces this. They have pale, almost gray skin. They have black eyes. The Raven Guard's gene seed is known to cause these exact mutations in its carriers: pale skin, dark eyes, a vaguely unsettling aspect that distinguishes them physically from the standard Astartes template. So the Carcharodons look like Raven Guard successors, and their gene seed carries Raven Guard markers, and the chapter uses ancient Raven Guard titles that haven't been in use since the Great Crusade. The title of Shade Lord, which the Carcharodons use for their chapter master, was last used by an individual called Arca's Fall, the Legion Master of the Raven Guard who preceded Corax's reunification with his legion. That name Shade Lord was used by one specific individual and then vanished from the record for 10,000 years before reappearing in the title Hierarchy of the Carcharodons. That is an almost impossible coincidence if there is no connection. And yet, the Ashen Claws, who are themselves former Raven Guard who live beyond the Ghoul Stars and who have dealings with the Carcharodons that span millennia, refuse to acknowledge the Carcharodons as true blood relatives. When the Ashen Claws interact with the Carcharodons, their leadership calls them mongrels, traitor-born. They hint at chimeric gene seed, a genetic composition that draws from more than one source. In one recorded exchange, when the Ashen Claws encountered a captive World Eater alongside Carcharodon warriors, their leader pointedly referred to the World Eater as a brother of the Carcharodons. That is an accusation leveled with intention, and it suggests that somewhere in the Carcharodons' genetic heritage, there is an element that the Raven Guard's renegade descendants recognize as coming from a very different and much darker source. The Night Lords were the 8th Legion. Their primarch was Conrad Kurz, called the Night Haunter, a being of exceptional darkness who turned his legion into an instrument of terror and massacre that ultimately sided with Horus during the heresy. The Night Lords as a whole are among the most irredeemable of the traitor legions. Their homeworld of Nostromo was a planet of perpetual darkness where crime and suffering were the dominant features of daily life, and the warriors recruited from that world brought those origins with them into the Astartes, producing soldiers who were brilliant at terror tactics, who struck from shadows and inflicted horror as a weapon, and who gradually lost whatever restraint might once have governed their conduct until they were something that even other Chaos Space Marines considered dangerous to be around. Their physical characteristics included pale, almost white skin, black eyes with black sclera, the same features the Carcharodons display. The theory that has gained significant traction among serious lore enthusiasts is not that the Carcharodons are Night Lords' descendants in any straightforward sense, but rather that their genetic heritage is a mixture primarily Raven Guard, but with elements that came from another source, possibly including Night Lords' gene seed, acquired during the Horus Heresy period, when the Ashen Claws were actively fighting across the Nostromo sector and harvesting genetic material from fallen enemies for their own survival. The chimeric gene seed theory would explain why the Ashen Claws consider themselves genetically superior to the Carcharodons, while still being willing to trade recruits with them, because in that transaction, the Ashen Claws believe they are providing clean Raven Guard heritage to a chapter whose bloodline has been contaminated. What makes this theory particularly compelling is that it aligns perfectly with the behavior patterns the Carcharodons display in combat. Raven Guard doctrine is built around stealth, precision, and surgical strikes. Night Lord's doctrine is built around terror, overwhelming assault, and the psychological destruction of an enemy before the physical destruction even begins. The Carcharodons combine both. They appear without warning, which is pure Raven Guard operational philosophy. They move in utter silence, which belongs to neither legion in particular, but feels like an evolution of Raven Guard's stealth doctrine, taken to its absolute extreme. But when they close to engage, their combat style is nothing like the Raven Guard's careful, measured precision. It is savage, relentless, and specifically designed to create horror. They do not just defeat enemies. They annihilate them in ways that leave the surviving witnesses traumatized for the rest of their lives. Whether this mixture is the truth, or whether the Carcharodons are simply the product of 10,000 years of isolation and genetic drift from a pure Raven Guard origin, remains one of the great unresolved questions of the lore. What can be said with certainty is that whoever created them, whatever their blood carries, the thing they have become is entirely their own. Part 2. Arca's Fall and the Day of Exile. To understand the Carcharodons, you need to understand one of the strangest and most tragic events in the history of the 19th Legion, an event that took place in the decades before the Horus Heresy, when the galaxy was still ostensibly under the Emperor's control, and the Great Crusade was proceeding with the inexorable momentum of an unstoppable tide. The Raven Guard, before Corvus Corax joined them and claimed his place as their primarch, were not the subtle, shadow-oriented warriors they became under his leadership. The pre-Corax Raven Guard, or more accurately, the warriors of the 19th Legion who existed before their primarch was found, were a different kind of force. They had been shaped by Terra itself, by the wars and privations that preceded the Emperor's unification of humanity's homeworld, and they had what the records describe as a reputation for savage effectiveness, combined with practices that later generations would find deeply uncomfortable to examine too closely. They were effective, brutally, completely effective. But the means they used to achieve that effectiveness included practices that sat uncomfortably, even by the standards of a civilization that was, to be direct about it, using armies of genetically engineered superhuman warriors to conquer the galaxy. Arcus Fall was the Legion Master of this pre-Corax iteration of the 19th Legion. He held a title Shade Lord that would not be heard again for 10,000 years, not until it reappeared in the naming conventions of the Carcharodons Astra. Under his command, the 19th Legion had developed a particular method of operation that the broader crusade found useful enough to continue deploying them in difficult theaters, while simultaneously finding their methods concerning enough to want them, kept at arm's length from the political and ideological center of the Imperial project. When Corax was found, when the Primarch of the Raven Guard was reunited with his legion and began reshaping them in his own image, the process of transformation was not clean or comfortable for everyone it touched. Corax was a being who had been born on a prison moon called Lycaeus, who had spent his formative years in conditions of genuine brutality and deprivation, and who had emerged from that experience with a complex set of convictions about justice, freedom, and the difference between power that liberates and power that oppresses. When he looked at the practices that had defined his legion before his arrival, he saw things that troubled him, things that reminded him, perhaps, of what he had been born fighting against. The warriors who had served under Arcus Fall were not absorbed into the Corax-shaped Raven Guard without friction. Some of them adapted. Others were deployed on increasingly distant campaigns, sent to work in the far reaches of the galaxy, where the ideological concerns of the Crusade's more visible campaigns didn't apply, and where their particular skill set remained useful. The 11th chapter of the Raven Guard Legion, the formation that would later be known as the Ashen Claws, was among the units sent out in this manner, dispatched toward the Ghoul Stars on a crusade that was understood by everyone involved to be a form of exile as much as a military assignment. And somewhere in this period, another exile occurred. The records are thin to the point of non-existence, which is itself informative. But the Carcharodons' own legends speak of a day of exile, a moment when the wandering ancestors were sent beyond the galaxy's edge at the command of someone they describe as the Forgotten One. This individual commanded them to go, and their sacred duty, the Edicts of Exile, which govern every aspect of the chapter's behavior even in the 41st millennium, was handed down by this figure. The Emperor himself is understood by the Carcharodons to have sanctioned this exile, giving it the weight of divine mandate, but the Forgotten One was the one who issued the actual order. If the Shade Lord title belongs to Arcus Fall, and if Arcus Fall was himself the one who became the Carcharodons' founding figure, their primogenitor, in a meaningful cultural and perhaps genetic sense, then what we are looking at is a man who was the Legion Master of the Raven Guard before Corax arrived, who was gradually displaced by the Primarch's reforms, who was eventually sent beyond the edge of the galaxy with a formation of warriors who shared his approach to warfare, and who established the culture and creed that the Carcharodons still follow 10,000 years later. The title Shade Lord, used only by him in the historical record and then appearing again in the chapter hierarchy of the Carcharodons, is the single most suggestive piece of evidence connecting the chapter to their origins, a thread so thin it might snap if you pull it too hard, but too specific to be a coincidence. The warriors who followed into exile were given two things that defined everything that followed. They were given a mandate: find and destroy the enemies of mankind beyond the Imperium's borders, before those enemies could penetrate Imperial space. And they were given the Edicts of Exile, a set of laws and traditions that governed their conduct, their relationship with the Imperium they no longer lived within, and the circumstances under which they were permitted to return to known space. Those edicts were strict, almost impossibly strict, given the operational realities the chapter would face over the following millennia. They were permitted to enter Imperial space only to resupply, to conduct the red tithes that kept their numbers from dwindling to nothing, and to answer when the Imperium called them for a specific purpose. They were not permitted to settle permanently. They were not permitted to develop relationships with the worlds they touched in passing. They were supposed to remain exactly what they were, hunters in the dark, permanent, unending, carrying out their duty in the outer void until either the duty was done or the Emperor walked again among his people and released them from their service. That last condition is the one that matters most for understanding the Carcharodons psychologically, because it means their exile is theoretically temporary, Somewhere at the foundation of their culture is a belief, however attenuated by 10,000 years of waiting, that this will eventually end, that there is a way home. That the Forgotten One's mandate was not a death sentence, but a purpose, and that purposes, unlike sentences, have conclusions. Whether any individual Carcharodon truly believes this in a personal, emotionally invested sense is a different question. But the belief is there, woven into the theological framework they inherited from the very beginning, and it shapes everything about how they understand their own existence. This is what makes the Carcharodons genuinely tragic, in a way that their outward presentation of cold brutality doesn't immediately suggest. They are warriors who have been waiting for 10,000 years to be allowed to come home. Every generation that has lived and died in the dark between the stars has been waiting for a release that no currently living member of the chapter will see. The void is not just their operational environment, it is their inheritance, their prison, and the closest thing they have to home. They were born in darkness, and they will die in darkness. And somewhere in the foundations of their culture is a memory of a different kind of existence that none of them can personally access, but that all of them carry. Part 3. The Void Existence, Life in the Outer Dark. Picture what it actually means to be a Carcharodon. Not just in battle, but in the vast, silent stretches of time between battles, which for a chapter that roams the outer edges of the galaxy and beyond, constitute the majority of their existence. Space Marines in general spend more time traveling than fighting, but for most chapters that travel happens in the crowded, familiar confines of ships moving between worlds in known space, with ports to stop at, and the reassurance that, somewhere within range, there is a world full of human beings going about their lives, and the infrastructure of civilization, keeping things running. The Carcharodons have none of that. Their ships move through regions of space that have not been mapped, past stellar phenomena that have not been named, in a darkness so complete and so undiluted that it takes on a quality that transcends the merely physical. Their fleet is their home, their fortress monastery, their training ground, their community, and their world. Everything that sustains them physically and psychologically exists aboard a collection of warships whose exact composition and number the wider Imperium does not know. The flagship, one of the few Carcharodons' vessels whose name and characteristics have been documented, is the Necron, a battle barge of ancient provenance whose deck plans, recovered from records at the Segmentum Pacificus fleet base of Hydrafor, identify it as a heavily modified Charybdis-class Grand Cruiser built during the Great Crusade or Horus Heresy eras. If any sister ships of this vessel class still exist in the Imperium, they are so rare as to be essentially unknown. The Necron is slightly smaller than a standard battle barge, but is described by those who have studied the records as both swift and lethal. Exactly the qualities you would want in the core vessel of a chapter that has spent 10,000 years staying alive in the outer dark, through a combination of speed, aggression, and the judicious application of violence. When the Carcharodons travel between engagements, their Void Brothers, the standard battle brothers of the chapter, sleep in individual cryotanks. This is not the sleep of choice or preference, but of biological necessity, because existing in the lifeless dark beyond the stars for extended periods imposes a particular kind of psychological and physiological stress, even on the enhanced bodies of Space Marines. The younger brethren and initiates spend the most time in the tanks, using the meditational processes enabled by their Susan membrane implants to manage what the chapter calls void sickness, a deterioration of psychological equilibrium that comes from prolonged exposure to the absolute nothingness of deep space. The oldest Carcharodons, the veterans whose modifications have been accumulating for decades or centuries, find the tanks increasingly difficult to use. Something in them refuses the dormancy that should be their rest. The eldest of their number haven't used the cryotanks in Terran centuries, sleeping only in the fitful, inadequate way that mortals sleep. Awake too much, watching the dark through transparent viewports that show them nothing but more darkness. This gives you a sense of the psychological profile you are dealing with. The older a Carcharodon is, the more of the void he carries in himself, the less he can sleep. The more his body changes in the ways that ancient Astartes' bodies change. The pale skin deepens into something almost translucent. The black eyes become more absolute. The hard denticle nodules multiply across the skin surface, and the distance between the warrior and whatever he was before the gene seed took him grows so wide that it becomes effectively unmeasurable. New recruits, the initiates taken during the Red Ties, that will be discussed in detail later, undergo a process of transformation that deliberately strips away their previous identity and replaces it with Carcharodons' collective identity. Their names are taken from them and replaced with numerical designations. The number is not a rank, but an identifier, a way of locating an individual within the chapter's operational structure without granting them the personal significance that a name implies. The Carcharodons' theology holds that individuality is a weakness, that ego and personal pride are the kinds of vulnerabilities that kill warriors in the outer dark, that the collective purpose of the chapter must override the personal desires of any individual within it. Only after an initiate has proven himself in battle, earned his place in the Brotherhood through the shedding of blood and the completion of void vows. Specific personal commitments to the chapter's mission does he receive what the chapter calls a void name, a new name that is his alone, but that belongs to the chapter's naming traditions, rather than to whatever culture he was born into. The exile markings that distinguish Carcharodons' veterans are earned incrementally, awarded for specific acts of distinction in battle or for the completion of significant void vows. These markings are intricate, swirling patterns that spiral up the forearms and across shaved skulls, directly inspired by Maori Tamoko traditions, though translated through 10,000 years of cultural evolution into something that is now entirely the Carcharodons' own. The chief librarian of the chapter is one of the most heavily marked figures in the chapter's leadership, his armor inscribed with honors accumulated over what must be an extraordinary span of time. Older warriors bear more markings. The most ancient carry the accumulated record of their entire service etched into their skin and armor, a living archive of everything they have done and everything they have survived. The organizational structure of the chapter roughly parallels the Codex Astartes, but with sufficient variation to reflect their unique circumstances. Where other chapters have chapter masters, the Carcharodons have a Shade Lord. Where other chapters have captains, the Carcharodons have company masters. There is an additional title, Reaper Prime, given to the company master, who bears special responsibility for ensuring the chapter maintains its recruitment. This individual is, in many ways, among the most important figures in the chapter, outside the Shade Lord himself, because a chapter that cannot recruit dies, and the Carcharodons' methods of recruitment are complicated by their outsider status, their distance from settled imperial space, and the very specific conditions the Edicts of Exile impose on their activities in known space. The Reaper Prime is the one who executes the Red Tithes, who identifies suitable worlds for recruitment, who manages the process by which the Carcharodons maintain their numbers against the inevitable attrition of 10,000 years of continuous warfare in the most hostile corners of the galaxy. One feature of the Carcharodons' organization that has no parallel in any other chapter is the concept of the Void Exile. This is not simply a fate applied to those who fail the chapter or commit serious transgressions, though it is that. The Void Exile is also the destination of those who succumb to a particular gene seed madness the chapter calls the blindness, a condition that emerges in some Carcharodons as a consequence of the extreme aggression and bloodlust that their genetic heritage encourages, taken to a point where the afflicted warrior begins to lose the ability to distinguish friend from foe in the grip of combat frenzy. A space marine who begins to attack his own brothers is a catastrophe for any chapter. But for a chapter whose operational doctrine depends on absolute unity and the suppression of individual ego in service of the collective mission, it is an existential threat. The Void Exile is not an execution that would be too clean, too quick, too merciful for a chapter that exists at the edge of the abyss. The afflicted warrior is stripped of rank and title and sent alone into space, given a ship or a shuttle sufficient to carry him to whatever void mission the chapter assigns him, and expected to keep fighting until he dies. The Carcharodons do not waste warriors, even broken ones. They simply find uses for broken warriors that the broken warrior can fulfill alone, without putting the whole at risk. Part 4. The Culture, Faith, and Polynesian Soul of the Chapter. There is something unusual happening in the cultural construction of the Carcharodons that sets them apart from virtually every other Space Marine chapter in the Imperium. And that unusual thing is this: they feel genuinely old in a way that most chapters do not. Not old in the sense of possessing ancient equipment or claiming a long history. Many chapters do both of those things. Old in the sense that their culture has the texture of something that has been passed down through many generations of transmission, has lost its original sharp edges, and has taken on the particular density and opacity that only truly ancient traditions carry. You can feel the millennia in it, and the cultural roots that survived that 10,000 years of transmission are unmistakably, beautifully Polynesian. The influence is most apparent in three areas: the naming conventions, the physical markings, and the theological framework. All three draw from a cultural well that traces back to the ancient Pacific Islander civilizations of Old Terra, specifically the Maori traditions of Aotearoa, and the broader navigational and spiritual cultures of the Pacific peoples, who were among the most accomplished seafarers in human history, who crossed vast empty oceans in open vessels, using nothing but stars and instinct, and the deep cultural knowledge of what it meant to commit yourself to the trackless deep and trust that you would find what you were seeking on the other side. That resonance is not coincidental. The Carcharodons are, in the most fundamental sense, ocean navigators. Their ocean is simply the space between stars rather than the space between islands, and their vessels are warships rather than traditional craft. But the essential experience, the commitment to the void, the trust in navigation rather than the safety of known shores, the understanding that the deepest, darkest waters are where the most dangerous things live, and where the warriors worthy of those waters must eventually go, runs perfectly parallel to the traditions of Polynesian seafaring culture. Whoever first shaped the Carcharodons' cultural identity was drawing on that deep well of resonance with full understanding of what they were doing. The emperor, called Rangu or the Void Father, occupies a very different position in Carcharodons' theology than in the mainstream imperial cult. For most imperials, the emperor is a distant, unknowable divinity, a figure of awe and terror approached through the mediation of the ecclesiarchy's vast institutional apparatus of prayer and ritual and dogma. The Carcharodons' relationship with the emperor is older than the ecclesiarchy. They knew the emperor when he walked among mortals, or at least their ancestors did, and that lived memory, even if it has been transmitted through so many generations of telling and retelling that the specific details have dissolved, creates a different quality of connection. The Void Father is not an abstraction to them. He is the father of their forgotten one, the progenitor of their Primarch, the original source of the mandate that sent them into the dark. His authority is personal in a way that no amount of ecclesiarchal ceremony can replicate. The Forgotten One occupies the theological position that most chapters' primarchs occupy: the heroic founder, the ideal toward which all members of the chapter aspire, the being whose example defines what it means to be one of them. But where other chapters can name their primarch, can cite his teachings, can quote from texts he wrote, or stories recorded by those who served with him, the Forgotten One is defined by his absence from memory. The Carcharodons do not know who he was with any certainty. They know what he did: he sent them into the dark, he gave them their purpose, and he promised that purpose was not eternal. But his name, his face, the details of his history, all of this has dissolved into the particular mist that accumulates around things that have been carried in memory for 10,000 years, without the support of written records or accessible archives. He is the Forgotten One. His very title acknowledges that what he was to them individually has been lost. What remains is only what he commanded. The physical markings of the chapter serve as a living record of individual and collective history. The exile markings, the swirling, spiraling patterns that cover a veteran Carcharodon's forearms and scalp, are awarded for specific achievements, which means that a sufficiently experienced observer who understood the chapter's marking system could, in principle, read the history of an individual warrior from his skin. The patterns are not decorative in any casual sense. They are documentary. Each completed curl or geometric progression represents something done: a void vow fulfilled, a battle won, a tithe successfully completed, a moment where the individual subordinated his survival to the mission and emerged on the other side of that choice, still breathing. The chief librarian, whose markings represent an extraordinary accumulation of service, is, in this sense, a walking archive, a record of centuries of engagement with the outer dark and everything it contains. The theological concept of the Maw deserves particular attention. The Carcharodons speak of the Maw with the same reverence that their nominal faith extends to the Void Father and the Forgotten One. But the Maw is something different from either of those figures. Where the Void Father is the divine authority and the Forgotten One is the heroic founder, the Maw is something that functions more like the void itself, the darkness, the deep, the consuming emptiness that surrounds them always, and that they must both master and resist. The Maw is what they come from. The Maw is what they serve. The Maw is also what they become if they lose their discipline and their purpose, and allow the darkness to swallow whatever remains of their humanity. The warrior who succumbs to the blindness is understood to have been taken by the Maw, consumed by the darkness, rather than channeling it in service of the chapter's mission. The great Carcharodon, the shark, is understood as a mask that the warriors wear, a shape they take on when they go into battle, but beneath the mask is still a person, or something that was once a person, and the mask must not be allowed to become the face. This tension between the void and the warrior, between the darkness and the self, is the central psychological drama of the Carcharodons' culture, and it is what gives their lore depth that transcends the surface-level appeal of gray armor and shark iconography. They are not simply violent. They are disciplined in their violence in a very specific way, and the discipline is not merely tactical but philosophical. The void is real. The darkness is real. The thing the void does to creatures that live in it for long enough is real, and the Carcharodons know this from 10,000 years of direct experience. Their culture exists precisely to maintain the distinction between the warrior who uses the darkness as a weapon and the darkness that uses the warrior as a vessel. That distinction is hard to maintain in the outer dark, and the fact that the chapter continues to function after 10,000 years suggests that their cultural tools for maintaining it are genuinely effective, or at least effective enough that what emerges on the other end of their recruitment and training process is something that can still be pointed at the Imperium's enemies without threatening the Imperium's friends. Usually, Part 5, The Red, Tithe How the Sharks Feed. Every Space Marine chapter must recruit. It is the biological reality of their existence. The process of creating new Astartes is slow, demanding, and has a meaningful failure rate, while the process of losing Astartes in battle is frequently much faster. Chapters that cannot recruit effectively dwindle and eventually cease to exist. The chapters that have survived for 10,000 years are the ones that found ways to keep their numbers viable against the constant pressure of attrition. And different chapters have developed very different solutions to this problem, depending on their circumstances. Most chapters recruit from their home worlds, whether those home worlds are planets they administer directly, feudal worlds, whose ruling classes supply aspirants as a matter of tradition, or feral worlds, whose harsh conditions naturally select for the kind of exceptional physical specimens that survive the Astartes modification process. The Carcharodons cannot do this. They have no homeworld, or they did not for most of their history. They cannot maintain the kind of sustained relationship with a planet and its population that produces reliable recruitment pipelines. Their edicts of exile prohibit them from settling, from remaining in any given place long enough to build the institutional infrastructure that stable chapter recruitment requires. Their solution is the Red Tithe, and it is one of the most disturbing practices in the entire Astartes playbook, which, given the competition for that particular distinction, is saying something significant. When the Carcharodons need to replenish their numbers, they identify a suitable world, typically an imperial world, in a region where their approach will not be immediately flagged as a hostile action, or a feral world whose populations have the physical and psychological qualities that make good Astartes aspirants. They descend on this world without warning. Their ships enter the system dark. Their forces deploy quickly and comprehensively, establishing control over the population centers they need to access before local authorities have time to mount any meaningful resistance. And then they take people, not randomly. The Red Tithe has internal logic and methodology. The potential aspirants, young men, of the appropriate physical specifications, are identified and separated. They are given a chance to prove their worth, which in the Carcharodons' assessment methodology typically means fighting each other to the death. The strongest, most resilient, most psychologically formidable survivors of that process become initiates, the first step toward Astartes modification. But the chapter's needs extend beyond just warriors. They need chapter serfs to crew their ships, maintain their equipment, and perform the countless functions that a fleet-based chapter cannot sustain with Astartes alone. A broader selection of the world's population is taken for these purposes. People who are not aspirant material, but who are functional and trainable, and who can be inducted into the service hierarchy of the chapter's ships. Those who are left behind after the tithe is complete find themselves in a situation that varies depending on how the local authorities responded to the chapter's arrival. If they cooperated, if they allowed the process to proceed without resistance, the damage is limited to the taking of the tithe itself, which is significant but not catastrophic for a world with a sufficient population. The Carcharodons, despite their reputation, do observe a certain procedural order in these activities. They have a right, granted to them by the Edicts of Exile that have imperial sanction at the highest level, to take what they need from imperial worlds in service of their mission. They exercise that right efficiently rather than gratuitously, taking what they require and not more. Arbitrators, the Imperium's law enforcement presence, are specifically protected. The Carcharodons acknowledge that arbitrators serve the Emperor's law and will not take them unless they interpose themselves in the tithe in ways that make them obstacles to the process, rather than neutral enforcers of order. But if there is resistance, if the planetary defense forces attempt to stop the tithe, if the local governor decides that the Carcharodons' claim to this right is insufficient justification for what they are doing, the response is proportionate to the resistance and then some. The chapter does not accept interference with the tithe as a matter of principle. Their ability to continue their mission depends entirely on their ability to replace losses, and anything that threatens that replacement threatens the entire purpose for which they were sent into the outer dark. They will destroy resistance methodically and without particular anger, but with the kind of absolute thoroughness that leaves very little room for second attempts. The aftermath of a red tithe tends to be specific in its character. If things proceeded according to the chapter's plan, there is one traumatized, shell-shocked survivor capable of bearing witness to what happened. One person left specifically to tell the story. This is deliberate. The Carcharodons maintain their legend through precisely calibrated terror. One survivor creates a story. Stories spread. And a world that has heard the story of what happens when the gray ships come will behave very differently when the gray ships come again, which makes subsequent tithes smoother and requires less violence. The chapter is brutal in the way that apex predators are brutal, not gratuitously, not from pleasure in the suffering of prey, but with the calculated efficiency of creatures that have spent 10,000 years ensuring their survival against every conceivable obstacle. The Red Tithe, depicted in Robbie McNiven's first Carcharodons novel, takes place on Zartak, a prison world in the outer reaches where the chapter has previous history. The newly promoted company master Baal Sher, whose own origins connect him to Zartak in ways that create personal stakes in the mission, leads the third company in a tithe that is complicated from the outset by the arrival of a Night Lord's warband with their own interest in the planet. The Night Lords have come to spread terror and gather recruits of their own kind. The Carcharodons have come for their legitimate entitlement. The collision between these two predatory forces produces one of the most compelling pieces of Carcharodons fiction available, precisely because it forces a direct comparison between what the chapter does and what the Night Lords do. And while the distinction is real, it is narrow enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. The chapter librarian involved in that campaign, Te Kahurangi, the Pale Nomad, whose title is itself another echo of ancient Raven Guard heritage, is one of the most ancient space marines alive in the setting. A being who is only 3 generations removed from the original exiles who founded the chapter. He has accumulated markings and memories and biological changes over centuries that have made him something that most space marines would find alarming to contemplate. He has the denical growths along his elbows and neck, the shark skin texture that older Carcharodons develop, as their gene seed's unique mutations express themselves fully over time. He is the institutional memory of the chapter, in a way that no archive can replicate, because he carries in his organic memory connections to the founding period that no written record can substitute for. Beyond the Red Tithe, the chapter has a secondary recruitment arrangement that is unique to them. Their relationship with the Ashen Claws, which will be discussed at length later, provides an additional source of recruits in times when the Red Tithes are insufficient, or impractical. The genetic complications this arrangement involves, the hints of chimeric heritage that it introduces into the chapter's already murky bloodline, are accepted as necessary costs of survival. The Carcharodons are nothing if not pragmatic. They have been surviving in the outer dark for 10,000 years by making the decisions that needed to be made, regardless of whether those decisions were comfortable, and recruitment is one of the areas where that pragmatism is most starkly visible. Part 6. The Pentarchy of Blood and the War of the False Primarch. In 860 of the 33rd millennium, the High Lords of Terra did something that they would subsequently work very hard to ensure no one remembered. They convened what was called the Pentarchy of Blood. The War of the False Primarch is one of the most thoroughly purged events in the entire Imperial historical record. What is known, which is to say, what has survived the deliberate effort to delete it, is fragmentary and contradictory, and leaves enormous gaps that can be filled only by inference and speculation. What can be established with reasonable confidence is this. Something happened in the Segmentum Pacificus in the middle of the 33rd millennium that plunged it into a state of anarchy lasting approximately 80 years. This something involved a figure the surviving records call the False Primarch, a being whose nature and origins are almost entirely obscure, but whose existence was sufficiently threatening to the Imperium's stability that the High Lords of Terra treated the response to it as a matter requiring extraordinary measures. The extraordinary measure was the Pentarchy of Blood. 5 Space Marine chapters, the Carcharodons, the Red Talons, the Flesh Eaters, the Charnel Guard, and the Death Eagles were given a mandate by the High Lords that was unprecedented in scope and that would never be repeated in quite the same form. They were authorized to systematically destroy 11 other Space Marine chapters that had been declared traitoris perdita, guilty of crimes serious enough to warrant their total annihilation. Not defeat, not censure, not dissolution and reorganization, annihilation. Their battle brothers slaughtered to the last, their homeworlds laid waste, their genetic heritage ended, their traditions obliterated, their very existence erased from the record of the Imperium. This meant that the Pentarchy was tasked with killing Space Marines at a scale that has only very rarely been approached in the Imperium's history. And the fact that it was done, the fact that 11 chapters were destroyed by the 5 chosen executors, suggests that the threat represented by the False Primarch was genuinely severe enough to justify these extreme measures. What is interesting from the perspective of understanding the Carcharodons is the question of why they were chosen for this role. Look at the 5 chapters selected. The Red Talons have a reputation for savage effectiveness in combat. The Flesh Eaters are successors of the Blood Angels with the particular genetic curse that bloodline carries, and the bloodlust it produces makes them formidable in close combat in ways that are difficult to stand against. The Charnel Guard share certain aesthetic and operational characteristics with the Death Guard, in the sense that they embrace mortality and the atmosphere of endings in ways that give them a psychological edge in prolonged, attritional conflict. The Death Eagles are the most enigmatic of the group, their inclusion perhaps explained by things we cannot access, rather than by a publicly visible reputation. And the Carcharodons. Why the Carcharodons? Because they are willing to do what is necessary, because their operational doctrine does not include sentimentality about fellow Astartes, does not include the particular hesitation that might affect a chapter which regularly operates alongside its fellows, and has built relationships and mutual understandings, and a sense of shared brotherhood with other chapters. The Carcharodons have been in the outer dark. They do not have those relationships. To them, another Space Marine chapter that has been declared traitor is simply a target that happens to be harder to kill than most, and harder targets require more careful application of force. But the category difference between a traitor chapter and a hostile Xeno species is in practical terms minimal when you approach it from the perspective of mission completion. During the War of the False Primarch, the Carcharodons' conduct was reported by those few who observed them operating alongside the other Pentarchy chapters as both completely effective and deeply strange. They attended strategy councils only when formally required, and they sent line warriors rather than officers. People whose presence in the room communicated precisely nothing about the chapter's assessment of the situation or its intentions. because the people sent had no authority to convey such information, even if they had wished to do so. They fought with single-minded ferocity when engaged, moving with the complete, hunting silence that was their signature, striking through enemy formations in ways that combined stealth and shock assault in a ratio that other chapters found difficult to anticipate or replicate. They had no interest in territorial gains, which made their approach to the campaign essentially unpredictable. From the perspective of conventional military planning, they were not trying to hold anything, only to destroy, and the mobility this gave them allowed them to range across the theater in ways that pinned the opposing partisan chapters in place, defending against an attack that could come from any direction at any time. The War of the False Primarch ended. The 11 declared traitor chapters were destroyed. The Segmentum Pacificus was brought back under control, and then the records were expunged. The High Lords of Terra, for reasons that make complete sense once you have thought about them for a moment, decided that a war, in which the Imperium's solution involved ordering 5 Space Marine chapters to annihilate 11 others, was not the kind of war that should be widely known about. If it became generally understood that the High Lords possessed both the authority and the means to simply erase chapters of the Adeptus Astartes when they found them inconvenient, the political implications for the chapters that survived would be complex in ways the High Lords did not want to manage. The erasure was not total, as erasures rarely are in practice. Fragments survived in sealed archives. Pieces of the record were preserved by parties who had their own reasons to maintain the information even after official policy required its deletion. And the Carcharodons themselves carry whatever memory of the event has persisted through their unusual relationship with their own history, which is to say that what they remember of the Pentarchy of Blood is probably more accurate than what anyone in the Administratum can access, but is expressed in the mythological language of a culture that does not maintain written records in the way that bureaucratic institutions do. What can be said with certainty is that the choice of the Carcharodons for this role reveals something important about how the High Lords of Terra perceived them, even in this early period of the chapter's documented existence. They were chosen not despite their isolation and their darkness, but because of it. Their distance from normal Imperial social structures, their lack of attachment to the broader community of Space Marine chapters, their willingness to apply total violence to any target without the moral complexity that would affect a chapter with deeper connections to the institution, being asked to destroy parts of itself. All of these qualities made them ideal instruments for a task that required a hand that could not be stayed by sentiment. The Carcharodons were the blade that the Imperium kept in its deepest, most private drawer, the one you only brought out when you needed something done that you could never afford to acknowledge you had done. Part 7. The Badab War. The Sharks Arrive. For most of the Warhammer 40,000 fan community, the Badab War is the campaign that put the Carcharodons on the map in any meaningful sense. Before the Forge World Imperial Armor volumes that covered this conflict were released, the Carcharodons were essentially a footnote, a name that appeared briefly in an early White Dwarf article about the Badab uprising, given a few terse sentences of description before the article moved on to the chapters it was actually interested in. The implication that something not quite right lurked behind those few sentences was there if you looked for it, but there was not enough material to develop it into a full picture of what the chapter actually was. The Badab War changed that completely. Forge World's Imperial Armor Volumes 9 and 10 gave the conflict its definitive treatment, expanding the Carcharodons from a marginal notation into one of the most compelling presences in the entire campaign. Precisely because of the ambiguity of their role and the alarm they generated among their nominal allies as much as their declared enemies. The Badab War itself requires some context. In the early 900 seconds of the 41st millennium, the Astral Claws chapter, led by their chapter, Master Luft Huron, who would eventually be known as Huron Blackheart, and who would go on to become one of the most significant Chaos warlords in the Maelstrom region, seceded from the Imperium. The secession built over several decades of escalating tension, tax disputes, and increasingly direct confrontation with Imperial authority before eventually exploding into open war. Several other chapters, the Mantis Warriors and the Lamenters, most notably sided with the Astral Claws in what became known as the Maelstrom Warders Rebellion. while a coalition of loyalist chapters was assembled to bring the secessionists back into compliance. The Carcharodons' entry into this conflict was neither invited nor expected. They simply appeared. The battle barge Necron and the warships accompanying it arrived without warning at the edge of the Golgothan wastes, and the initial response from both loyalist and secessionist forces was identical: alarm. A fleet of unidentified space marine vessels appearing without transponder identification in an active war zone is not an event that any commander processes calmly, regardless of which side of the conflict they are on. The Carcharodons were eventually identified, and their alignment loyalist established through direct negotiation, but even after they had made their allegiance clear, their presence remained a source of unease among the Imperial commanders. The reason for that unease became apparent quickly once they were deployed. The Carcharodons were given responsibility for the Endymion Cluster, a region of worlds within the Maelstrom Zone whose populations had maintained loyalty to the Mantis warriors. The chapter's approach to this assignment was to implement what they called a scorched world policy, a systematic campaign of destruction against the cluster's infrastructure, population centers, and anything else that supported the enemy's ability to wage war. Planet after planet was subjected to this treatment. Infrastructure was destroyed. Populations were not spared in the casual way that a loyalist chapter engaged in population protection would spare them. The Carcharodons did not massacre civilians for sport, but they treated civilian infrastructure as a valid military target, and civilian casualties as an acceptable consequence of effective military action, in a way that the other loyalist chapters present found extremely difficult to accept. The logic was cold and brutal, but not irrational. The Mantis warriors, as honorable warriors with a deep connection to the populations of the cluster and a personal commitment to protecting those populations, could not stand by and watch the Carcharodons destroy the worlds they had sworn to defend. The Carcharodons knew this. They were using the Mantis warriors' own code of honor as a weapon against them, forcing them to commit their forces to defending worlds that were strategically marginal rather than concentrating them for a decisive engagement. It was precisely the kind of indirect, psychologically sophisticated military calculation that you would not necessarily expect from a chapter whose surface presentation is one of absolute, undiscriminating violence. But the Carcharodons are not unintelligent. They are brutal when they need to be brutal, but the brutality is directed by a strategic clarity that makes it genuinely terrifying rather than merely destructive. The Mantis warriors, forced to respond to the destruction of the worlds they had pledged to protect, were drawn into a series of engagements that depleted their strength at exactly the wrong time. The Carcharodons kept withdrawing when resistance became too heavy, avoided battles they were not certain of winning, and returned from unexpected directions to strike at positions the enemy thought were secure. By the time the campaign against the Mantis warriors reached its decisive phase, the chapter had been worn down to a shadow of its full strength, unable to concentrate the forces needed for the kind of sustained resistance that might have changed the outcome. But it was the Carcharodons' involvement in the final stages of the war, the campaign against Badab Primaris itself, that most dramatically demonstrated what they were. Luft-Huron's position on Badab Primaris, his seat of power, the fortress from which he had directed the entire rebellion, needed to be broken decisively. The Carcharodons were given responsibility for attacking the planet's primary infrastructure, while the Star Phantoms prosecuted the direct assault on Huron's stronghold. The chapter executed their assignment with exactly the efficiency that their record predicted. They located the reactor cores of the primary hives on Badab Primaris and sabotaged them. The reactor cores did not fail cleanly. They failed catastrophically, triggering tectonic upheaval across the planet on a scale that made a hurried evacuation not just advisable but absolutely essential for survival. The secessionist forces broke under this pressure. Huron's position collapsed. The war was effectively over, but the planet of Badab Primaris was, in the process, condemned. The tectonic instability that the sabotage triggered was not something that could be stabilized after the fact. Badab Primaris was set on the path to its eventual destruction by the Carcharodons' interpretation of their assignment, and the loyalist forces, including the Star Phantoms, lost warriors in the hurried, chaotic retreat that followed the detonations. The Star Phantoms have carried their resentment of the Carcharodons for this ever since. It is a grievance that the Carcharodons appear entirely unmoved by, which, given their personality profile, is exactly what you would expect. They were given a mission. They completed the mission. The collateral consequences of completing the mission were what they were. The Star Phantoms' feelings about those consequences are not the Carcharodons' problem. After the war, the chapter was given a significant reward for their service. The Firehawks, who had been given control of the Mantis Warriors' territory in the Endymion cluster as part of the post-war settlement, agreed to allow the Carcharodons to conduct a final operation in the region. Before departing, the chapter went to the Tranquility System, where the Mantis Warriors had maintained hidden fortresses and supply caches. They ransacked those fortresses completely, taking every piece of equipment, every weapon, every scrap of material they could carry. And they took an entire generation of the system's young men, forcing them to fight each other to the death in the Carcharodons' brutal method of identifying worthy aspirants and then loading the survivors into their ships. Then they left. The Necron and its accompanying fleet disappeared back into the dark between the stars, carrying their new recruits and their plunder, and the Endymion cluster was left behind. Whatever intelligence or surveillance assets the Imperium might have had on the Carcharodons' movements were insufficient to track them once they left the Ultima Segmentum. They were gone as completely as if they had never arrived, leaving behind only the wreckage and the memories and the particular story that the Badab War generated, which was thereafter told and retold and studied by anyone trying to understand what the Carcharodons were and what they were capable of. Tybros, the Red Wake. Every chapter of Space Marines has figures who define it in the popular imagination, individuals whose personal legend concentrates in one person everything that the chapter represents. For the Carcharodons, that figure is Tybros. His title is the Red Wake. His formal designation is Reaper Lord of the Void, the Shade Lord of the Carcharodons, the chapter master who commands the entire fraternity of the Outer Dark. He is simultaneously the company master of the chapter's elite first company, the Red Brethren, a dual role that reflects both the intimacy with which he maintains control of the chapter's most experienced warriors, and the personal style of leadership that is entirely his own. He is enormous. Tybros is large even by Space Marine standards, which already places him far beyond anything in the normal human frame of reference. Among his fellow Carcharodons, he is physically distinguishable at range simply by the mass he projects. This is not a trivial distinction in a chapter where every member has been genetically engineered to extremes of physical development. Something about Tybros exceeds what the standard Astartes template produces, whether through extraordinary gene seed expression, generations of void adaptation, or simply the accumulation of modification and enhancement that an extremely old and extremely well-survived warrior carries. He is never seen without his archaic Terminator armor, a suit of ancient battle plate covered in heavy, studded panels that have been described as reminiscent of Mark V Heresy pattern armor, accumulated over the years into a configuration that exists nowhere in any armory registry, and that reflects the particular aesthetic sensibility of a warrior who has been wearing and modifying the same battle plate for what must be a very, very long time. When he communicates with other Space Marine commanders, as he did during the Badab War, Tybros speaks in a soft whisper, not quiet for lack of volume capability. He is capable of projecting his voice through a battlefield-rated Vox amplifier if he wants to be heard. The whisper is a choice, and the whisper carries, according to everyone who has had to sit across a negotiating table from it, the promise of certain death. There is something in the specific register of his voice, its quietness, its patience, its absolute absence of any emotional inflection that might indicate the existence of anything inside it that could be appealed to, that reaches the threat assessment centers of the human brain and causes them to treat what they are hearing as extremely dangerous, regardless of the content of the words. His face, on those rare occasions when he removes his helmet, is described as a corpse-white nightmare with half the bones of his face exposed in a bloodless grimace. This is not cosmetic enhancement or battlefield intimidation prosthetics. This is what Tybros's face looks like under his helmet. His skin has drawn back from his bones in ways that the standard human body is not supposed to permit, and his eyes are solid black from edge to edge. The full expression of the Carcharodon's most pronounced physical mutation in its most complete form. He keeps his helmet on most of the time. Not because the face alarms him, nothing alarms Tyberos, or if it does, nothing about him shows it, but because he is a practical warrior, and a helmet in an active combat environment is more useful than a bare face. Around his waist hangs a human skull on a chain, ancient, yellowing. No one outside the chapter knows whose skull it is, and the chapter is not telling. Trophy skulls are more commonly associated with Chaos Space Marines than with Loyalists, which is itself a statement about what the Carcharodons are and are not. They are loyal to the Emperor. They are not loyal to the social conventions that define loyalty in the minds of most Imperial citizens, and they do not particularly care whether their personal aesthetic choices generate discomfort in the people observing them. But none of this, not the size, not the whisper, not the face, not the skull on the chain, is what makes Tyberos genuinely terrifying. What makes him genuinely terrifying is hunger and slake. These are his weapons. They are a matching pair of gauntlets, each one a combination of Power Fist, Lightning Claw, and Chain Fist Blade fused into a single weapon system. A configuration that exists nowhere in any standard armory catalog, and that the Mechanicus would likely describe as architecturally inadvisable if anyone had thought to ask them before the weapons were built. They pulse with vast power that makes the air in Tyberos's immediate presence feel charged, alive in the particular way that barely contained destructive energy charges air. In use, they are capable of annihilating a wide variety of targets with equal facility, from heavily armored space marines to Tyranid bioconstructs, to the kinds of fortified positions that would stop most assault units cold. The history of these weapons is one of the more entertaining and revealing details in all of Carcharodon's lore. They did not originally belong to Tyberos. They belonged to the Ashen Claws, the renegade Ravenguard survivors who dwell beyond the Ghoul Stars, and with whom the Carcharodons have their complicated, transactional, mutually suspicious relationship. At some point in the history of the chapter, the exact date is uncertain, the chapter found itself in negotiations with the Ashen Claws for recruits or materiel, and those negotiations broke down in a manner that resulted in Tyberos challenging the Ashen Claws chapter master, a figure named Nehat Nev, to single combat. The fight happened. Tyberos won. He took hunger and slake from the defeated Nehat Nev as his prize, and the Ashen Claws have been furious about it ever since. A low-grade resentment that flavors all their subsequent interactions with the Carcharodons in ways that the Carcharodons appear entirely indifferent to. What makes Tyberos remarkable as a physical combatant beyond the weapons is his speed. He is enormous. He is in Terminator armor. Terminator armor is by its nature the heaviest and most movement-restrictive variant of Space Marine battle plate, the kind that trades mobility for near-absolute protection in a trade that most Terminators accept as entirely reasonable given what they are walking into. And yet Tyberos moves in that armor, with a speed and agility that observers describe as almost too fast to track. During the Badab War, witnesses reported him as a blood-spattered killing machine, moving almost too fast for the eye to follow, leaving behind him nothing but mangled, shredded corpses that had been processed through hunger and slake's combined capabilities before their owners had fully understood they were in danger. At the conclusion of Robbie McNiven's Outer Dark novel, Tyberos kills 3 Tyranid warriors in a span of seconds before casually climbing into a nearby Tyranid boarding pod and silently eliminating everything inside it. The casual thoroughness of the act, reflecting a warrior who has long since passed the point where any individual engagement presents him with a meaningful challenge. He was in charge of the Carcharodons' forces throughout the Badab War, and his conduct during that campaign established the chapter's reputation in the Imperial consciousness in ways that the previous historical appearances had not managed, simply because the Badab War was documented in detail that the Pentarchy of Blood and other earlier engagements were not. He led his Red Brethren Terminators from the front in assault after assault against the secessionist forces, distributing the other veterans of his first company among the chapter's other forces to serve as both force multipliers and his personal intelligence network, his eyes, ears, and enforcers within the chapter's own structure, ensuring that the Carcharodons' fleet of separate companies did not drift from the collective purpose that the chapter's discipline required. He is described as utterly immovable, a vast, silent presence whose pronouncements are always final. This is the quality that makes him genuinely effective as a leader, in addition to being effective as a weapon. He does not debate. He does not reconsider. He does not manage upward by accommodating the preferences of the commanders he nominally answers to during the Badab War. The nominal commander of the Loyalist forces received the Carcharodons' cooperation when it was convenient for the chapter's mission, and received cold, polite non-engagement when it was not, and there was nothing the nominal commander could do about either response, because the Carcharodons' mandate does not derive from the chain of command that governs other Space Marine chapters. They answer to the edicts of exile and to whatever those edicts permit, and Tyberos's interpretation of those edicts is the operative one for every Carcharodon in the void. The whispers within the chapter itself about the weapon's history carry an interesting implication. The fact that Hunger and Slake once belonged to the Ashen Claws suggests a technological heritage that connects the weapons to the pre-heresy Raven Guard in ways that the weapon's extreme configuration might begin to explain. If they were built in an era when the constraints that currently govern the Mechanicus's weapons programs did not yet apply, if they were produced for warriors who operated entirely outside the normal Astartes supply chain, then the architectural inadvisability of their design becomes historically understandable even if it remains unusual. They are relics of an older time, tools of a kind that only ancient warriors from the Outer Dark would still be carrying into battle, maintained across millennia by the expertise of the chapter's own tech marines, and the singular determination of their owner to keep functioning a pair of weapons that the Mechanicus would struggle to replicate. Part 9. The Ashen Claws Brothers in the Dark. The relationship between the Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws is one of the most interesting dynamics in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, not because it is warm or admirable, it is neither, but because it reveals something about both parties that you would not understand from observing either one in isolation. The Ashen Claws began their existence as the 18th chapter of the Raven Guard Legion during the Great Crusade, a formation dispatched to the Outer Darkness on a crusade that took them away from the main body of the Legion and left them operating independently in regions where direct oversight from Corax was impossible or simply didn't happen. They were Terran-born, these warriors, from the pre-Corax Legion warriors shaped by Old Terra's wars and privations rather than by the Primarch's reforming influence, with practices and temperaments that reflected their origins more than their official parent organization would have been comfortable acknowledging. When the Horus heresy began, when the news reached them of what was happening in the wider galaxy, Horus's betrayal, the heresy's catastrophic disruption of everything the Great Crusade had built, Corax's own near destruction at Istvan V, the 18th chapter, made a decision that defied easy categorization. They declared for neither side, not Horus, not the Emperor. They looked at a galaxy tearing itself apart over a conflict between two beings, who they no longer regarded as having a legitimate claim on their loyalty, and they chose a third path: independence, isolation, survival in the Outer Dark on their own terms. But independence is not the same as moral emptiness, and the Ashen Claws, despite their renegade status, demonstrated that their rejection of the heresy's binary was not nihilism when they directed their substantial military capacity against the Night Lords. Nostromo, the Night Lords' homeworld, was already a darkness-saturated world by any standard, and the Ashen Claws attacked its sector with a ferocity that had clear ideological coloring. These were warriors striking at the most corrupt expression of the darkness they themselves operated within, punishing the Night Lords for being what they were, even as the Ashen Claws themselves occupied a morally ambiguous position that made them something other than heroes of the Imperium. Their current state, in the 41st millennium, is one of slow decline. According to Outer Dark, the Ashen Claws have settled on a world called Atargatis Prime, beyond the Ghoul Stars region, and their numbers are dwindling. The recruiting methods available to an outlawed chapter with no official standing and no access to the normal supply chains of the Imperium are limited, and the attrition of 10,000 years has taken a toll that Raven Guard-derived gene seed struggles to fully compensate for. They persist, but the persistence has the quality of a wounded thing that has not yet accepted its injury. The Carcharodons know the Ashen Claws exist, Very few other beings in the galaxy share this knowledge. The relationship between the two chapters is built on this mutual knowledge, and on the mutual utility that flows from it. The Carcharodons need recruits in periods when the red tithes are insufficient, and the Ashen Claws have aspirants to offer in exchange for the technology and gene seed that the Carcharodons can provide from their accumulated resources. It is a transaction, not a friendship. Both parties approach it with the wariness of experienced negotiators who know that the being across the table is dangerous, and that the table is the only thing preventing something more violent than commerce from occurring. The Ashen Claw's disdain for the Carcharodons runs deep and is expressed specifically in genetic terms. They believe the Carcharodons' gene seed is contaminated, a bastardized mixture that contains elements no pure Raven Guard descendant should carry. When they trade gene seed with the Carcharodons, the Ashen Claws make a point of verifying that what they are providing is not being mixed with the contaminant element before being used in their own succession. A procedural precaution that communicates exactly what they think of, the Carcharodons' genetic heritage. The specific accusation that the Carcharodons carry Night Lord's genetics connects back to everything we discussed earlier about the chapter's origins. The Ashen Claws spent the Horus Heresy fighting across Nostromo, harvesting gene seed from fallen enemies, and trading in the genetic materials of multiple origins as a matter of survival. If the Carcharodons' founding period overlapped with a period when the Ashen Claws were conducting this activity, if some of those Night Lord's progenoids ended up in the founding gene pool of the Carcharodons, whether by design or by the desperate pragmatism of a chapter that needed to survive in the outer dark without a stable supply line to a loyal Forge world, then the Ashen Claw's accusation is an observation based on direct genetic knowledge, not speculation. What gives the relationship particular depth is that despite the disdain, despite the mutual distrust, despite the fact that their leaders physically fight each other over possession of ancient weapons, the two chapters continue to come together when the stakes are high enough. During the Tyranid campaigns in the Outer Dark, when the Hive fleets began pressing hard against the edges of the galaxy in the regions where both chapters operate, the Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws fought alongside each other. The Ashen Claws warriors, given the opportunity to test themselves against Tyranids, were reportedly revitalized by the experience in ways that their chapter's declining situation had not permitted for some time. The Carcharodons, for their part, were quietly grateful for the assistance, and acknowledged it in the particular way that Carcharodons acknowledge things without explicit ceremony, without the kind of warm expression that other chapters might use to mark an alliance, but through the sustained willingness to continue the relationship that provides the clearest signal of all that they consider it worth maintaining. Nehat Nev, the Ashen Claws chapter master who lost Hunger and Slake to Tyberos, continues to lead his chapter from Atargates Prime. He is not described as having resolved his feelings about that particular loss, which is understandable. Having your most significant weapons claimed by a rival who defeated you in single combat is not the kind of thing that fades with time, especially when that rival continues to show up, periodically demanding trade concessions. The dynamic between Nev and Tyberos, between the declining chapter that considers itself the purer bloodline and the chapter that is clearly winning the long game of void survival, has a particular bitterness to it that both parties have chosen to manage through the transaction of commerce, rather than allow it to escalate into outright war. Mutual self-interest is, ultimately, a more stable foundation than affection. And in the Outer Dark, stability, even the stability of a tense, resentful trade relationship, is worth more than warmth. Part 10. War in the Deeps, the Tyranid Wars. As the 41st millennium ground toward its catastrophic conclusion, and the Tyranid hive fleets began to make their presence felt in the wider galaxy, the Carcharodons found themselves facing an enemy that was uniquely suited to making the Outer Dark dangerous, in ways that even their considerable experience had not fully prepared them for. The Tyranids are not just powerful. They are drawn to the light of the Astronomicon, which means they are drawn toward the center of the galaxy, toward the heart of the Imperium, and in their approach from the outer darkness, they passed directly through the regions where the Carcharodons had been hunting and patrolling for 10,000 years. The War in the Deeps, as it came to be known, within the chapter's own tradition, was a campaign of attrition that lasted for years and that demanded from the Carcharodons a kind of sustained, grinding engagement that their usual hit-and-fade tactics were not perfectly optimized for. Tyranids do not have morale in the conventional sense. You cannot demoralize a hive fleet. You cannot use psychological pressure or terror or the threat of consequences to make them hesitate. They respond to material destruction only, and they can absorb material destruction at a scale that most enemies cannot begin to approach, because the biomass they lose in one engagement is simply recycled into new organisms for the next one. Fighting Tyranids is, in this sense, like fighting the ocean. You can drive it back temporarily, but it never gets tired, and it never forgets what it was doing before you interrupted it. The chapter adapted. The Carcharodons' void-boarding tactics, which involve the use of ancient weapon systems that fire enormous harpoon-like lances deep into enemy vessels, then drag those vessels in close on massive chains before disgorging Astartes into the helpless ship's interior, were developed over the course of their history, from techniques pioneered by the World Eaters Legion during the Great Crusade, and they work against Tyranid bioships with the same ruthless efficiency they work against anything else. A Tyranid hive ship that has been impaled by a Carcharodon's boarding harpoon and dragged within range of the Nicor's hangar bays is a target for exactly the kind of close-quarters biological termination that the Carcharodons practice better than almost anyone. The Outer Dark novel, written by Robbie McNiven and set 10 years after the events of Red Tithe, follows Baal Shar and his company as they attempt to use the world of Piety 5 as a bulwark against an incoming Tyranid advance. The campaign that results is one of the most revealing pieces of extended fiction about the Carcharodons, because it places them in a situation that their usual operational patterns have not prepared them for. Engagement with a significant civilian population under genuine threat, where the question of what the chapter owes to the people it is theoretically protecting is not abstract, but immediate. The Carcharodons' relationship with civilian populations is, to put it diplomatically, complicated. They do not massacre civilians. They are not the Night Lords, but they also do not protect civilians in the warm, personal sense that chapters like the Salamanders or the Space Wolves might. They protect populations the way a dam protects a valley, not with affection for the specific people who would otherwise drown, but as a mechanical consequence of structural integrity. Civilians are the resource the Imperium needs to continue producing the soldiers and materiel and genetic material that sustains the eternal war. Civilian populations on worlds the Carcharodons are defending are worth protecting for the same reason that warehouses full of ammunition are worth protecting. It is not personal. What Outer Dark does is complicate this. Baal Shar is not a cold machine. He was himself taken as a recruit from a world not unlike the ones the Carcharodons' policies most directly impact, and the specific world he is defending in this novel is not entirely without personal resonance for him. As the chapter engages, the Tyranid advance and simultaneously tries to manage the evacuation and defense of Piety V's population. Shar is forced to confront what the value of the people he is fighting for actually means, not as an abstract strategic question, but as a personal one. In the way that personal questions come, when you are standing in the mud, watching specific individuals face specific dangers, and the mathematics of acceptable losses starts to have faces attached to it. The Tyranid War in the Outer Dark also brought the Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws together, as discussed. The Ashen Claws, for all their deteriorating circumstances, remained genuinely capable warriors, and their deployment alongside the Carcharodons against the Hive fleet produced exactly the kind of brutal, effective joint operation that both chapters were designed for when their internal disagreements were set aside long enough to let them function. Tyberos himself appears at the novel's conclusion in exactly the form you would expect arriving at the moment of greatest need, operating at the interface between capability and catastrophe, personally eliminating a series of significant Tyranid threats with the casual ease of someone for whom the distinction between possible and impossible has long since ceased to be meaningful. The chapter's extended engagement with Tyranids had one significant secondary effect that the Red Tithe novel hints at and Outer Dark develops more fully. It deepened their experience of exactly what they were defending. The Carcharodons, spending years in close proximity to worlds under Tyranid attack, watching the process by which the Great Devourer strips planets to bare biological substrate and consumes everything that lived on them, developed in their particular stoic way, a reinforced understanding of why the mandate they had been given 10,000 years ago was not merely a punishment or an exile, but a genuine purpose. The things that come from the outer dark are real. The threat is real. The Carcharodons had been fighting it for millennia, while the rest of the Imperium was largely unaware of its scale, and the Tyranid Wars gave that long, lonely service, a context that even the most internally focused Carcharodon could not entirely dismiss. The biological mutations the chapter accumulates over extended Tyranid campaigns are also worth noting. The denticle growths that develop in aging Carcharodons are accelerated by close contact with Tyranid biomorphic material, and some warriors who have fought extensively in Tyranid boarding actions carry the evidence of those engagements in their skin in ways that are not easily distinguished from the normal aging process of their gene seed's expression. The line between what the void does to them and what the Tyranids do to them is in some biological respects difficult to draw, which creates an interesting, if uncomfortable, resonance with their self-conception as predators of the deep. They are changed by what they fight, the way deep-water creatures are changed by the pressures and temperatures of the depths they inhabit. Part 11. The Era Indomitus and what comes after. The creation of the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning catastrophe that divided the Imperium in two and brought the 41st millennium to its traumatic close, changed circumstances for the Carcharodons in ways that are still being processed in the available lore. The most concrete change is one that no chapter observer would have predicted a century before it happened. The Carcharodons now have a homeworld. The Mantis Warriors' former territory in the Endymion cluster had gone through several administrations since the Badab War, and with the disruptions of the Great Rift reshuffling the political and military landscape of the Ultima Segmentum, the Carcharodons were granted the Mantis Warriors' former homeworld of Utheka to do with as they pleased. The chapter that had spent 10,000 years specifically prohibited from settling, that had been defined in every aspect of its culture and operational doctrine by the principle of perpetual motion, perpetual exile, perpetual distance from any fixed point, that chapter now has a planet. What they have done with it, and what it means for the chapter's long-term identity, is not fully elaborated in current sources. The edicts of exile that governed their behavior for 10,000 years were based on a set of circumstances specifically, their distance from the Emperor's light, and their specific mandate to hunt enemies in the outer void, that the Great Rift and its aftermath have altered in ways that might require revision. Whether the chapter has actually revised those edicts, whether the receipt of Utheka represents a formal change in their status within the Imperium structure, or whether the planet serves primarily as a logistics base rather than a genuine home. In the cultural sense, these are questions that the current lore does not fully answer. Like many chapters in the aftermath of the Great Rift, the Carcharodons have received Primaris Space Marines through Robout Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade. The integration of Primaris technology and warriors into a chapter as deeply committed to its existing identity as the Carcharodons is an interesting problem to consider. Primaris Space Marines are new, in a way that fundamentally challenges a chapter whose identity is built around antiquity. The ancient equipment, the Mark V armor, the decades and centuries of accumulated modification that make Carcharodons veterans look like walking archaeological sites. None of this has any equivalent in the Primaris template, which is defined precisely by its newness, its cleanliness, its departure from the accumulated compromises of 10,000 years of improvised modification. A Primaris Carcharodon, decked in the chapter's gray and black, with exile markings beginning to accumulate on skin that still remembers what color it was before the gene seed took hold, is a figure in tension with himself in a way that is entirely in keeping with the chapter's general aesthetic of internal conflict between the void and the self. What can be said about the chapter's recent deployments suggests they continue to operate with the methods and philosophy that have defined them throughout the historical record. A 2020 White Dwarf account describes a Carcharodons force under Company Master Manfor fighting word-bearers, alongside elements of the Indomitus Crusade's fleet Secundus, a standard Carcharodons operation, in its basic contours, appearing without ceremony, fighting with characteristic efficiency, leaving behind the record of their effectiveness rather than any documentation of who they are or where they went afterward. Tiberos is not mentioned in this account, which, given the size and importance of the Indomitus Crusade in the current narrative, suggests he may be operating with the main body of the chapter in a theater that remains, as the Carcharodons themselves prefer, undocumented. The theological implications of Guilliman's return are something the chapter has presumably had to process. Their faith is built around a promise: the Void Father will walk again among mortals, and when he does, the edicts of exile will be overturned, and the chapter will be permitted to come home. Guilliman is not the Emperor. He is very explicitly not the Emperor. But he is a Primarch returned from death, a figure whose existence changes the calculus of what returning from incapacitation or death means in this setting. Whether the Carcharodons have interpreted Guilliman's return as meaningful to their own theological framework, whether any members of the chapter see in it a sign or a precedent that speaks to the eventual resolution of their exile, is a question that has not been answered in available sources. Given the chapter's general approach to existential questions, which is to say, stoic silence combined with continued mission performance, it seems unlikely that they have shared any such interpretation with outsiders, even if they have reached one internally. Part 12. The Combat Doctrine of the Outer Dark. To understand why the Carcharodons are feared in ways that even other terrifying chapters do not quite inspire, it helps to look specifically at how they fight not just the broad strokes, but the particular mechanical details of an operational approach refined over 10 millennia of warfare in the most unforgiving environments the galaxy provides. The fundamental principle is simple. They want to control the conditions of every engagement. The Carcharodons do not believe in fair fights, not in the sense of both parties entering the engagement with comparable information and comparable preparation. They believe in surprise, in hitting before the enemy is ready, in exploiting the specific psychological vulnerability that comes from facing a threat that materializes without warning from a direction you were not watching. This is the Raven Guard element of their heritage, expressed in its most extreme form. Stealth doctrine taken so seriously that entire generations of warriors have made the deliberate suppression of their own personality a part of combat preparation, because any expression of individuality produces a signal that a sufficiently attentive enemy might detect. Their ships run dark, no transponders, no communication until they choose to communicate. Their approach to system entry is carefully planned to maximize the time available for targeting assessment before their presence is detected, and their fleet deployments favor formations that offer multiple simultaneous strike options rather than concentrating force in ways that would force the enemy to respond to a single, predictable vector. When the Carcharodons make a boarding assault, they are committing to close-quarters elimination, and their warriors are prepared for that engagement in a very specific way. No noise, no battle cries, no expressions of individual emotion during the fight, an orchestrated silence that observers describe as deeply unnerving, even for people who are accustomed to being in combat situations. Their void-boarding tactics involve weapons that would be considered exotic even by the broad standards of Space Marine armory. The harpoon lance system, enormous spears fired from the Necron and its accompanying vessels, designed to penetrate the hulls of enemy ships and attach to their internal structure, then winch the impaled vessel in on massive chains until it is close enough for a boarding action, is identified in Imperial records as deriving from Great Crusade-era World Eater Legion doctrine. The World Eaters were a chapter that embraced close combat with a totality that eventually consumed them, and the void warfare technique they developed reflects that philosophy. Stop running, drag it close, get inside it, and finish it in the most immediate and personal way available. The Carcharodons adopted this technique and refined it through 10,000 years of practice into something extraordinarily effective. Their armory itself is a museum of Space Marine history. Mark V Heresy pattern armor predominates among their veterans, armor that was in production during the Horus Heresy, and that the Administratum and Mechanicus would normally have difficulty locating in functioning condition, let alone using as standard equipment. The Carcharodons maintain these ancient suits through the skills of their own tech marines, who have had to develop expertise in maintaining and repairing equipment that has not been in general production for 10,000 years. Their Terminator armor suits are individually modified in ways that would not be sanctioned by any standard Mechanicus protocol, each one a unique compromise between the original design and the survival requirements of whatever it has faced since it was first put into service. The variety is extraordinary. Examining the war gear of the Carcharodons Terminators, witnesses during the Badab War noted configurations of armor and weaponry that span the full length of the Imperium's history, as though the chapter's first company was a living catalog of every Terminator suit that had found its way into their possession over the course of millennia. When they close to engage, the silence becomes something different. Not emptiness, intensity. The assault of a Carcharodon's force in close combat is described by those who survived it as a physical experience as much as a tactical one, a pressure that has quality and weight separate from the mechanical damage being inflicted by the weapons. Their entire culture has invested itself in this moment, the long patience of the approach, the controlled stillness of the hunting posture, the accumulated intent of warriors who have been building toward this engagement for however long it took to get here, and when it releases, the result is not a measured, professional exchange of controlled violence. It is a tidal force. It is the thing that has been held back finally being let go, and the only thing on the other end of that release is the enemy. They are not incapable of restraint. The scorched world policy they implemented in the Endymion cluster during the Badab War was brutal, but calculated every element of the destruction they caused was in service of a specific strategic goal, which was to force the Mantis warriors to commit their forces to defensive engagements rather than offensive ones, wearing them down over time. The Carcharodons were not destroying those worlds out of bloodlust. They were following a tactical logic as cold and clean as the void they came from, a logic that simply did not assign any weight to civilian suffering in its calculations, because civilian suffering was not a variable the chapter's doctrine included in its tactical assessments. This is the quality that distinguishes them from chapters that are merely brutal. Brutal chapters fight hard and sometimes cause unnecessary damage through aggression or bloodlust or poor tactical control. The Carcharodons cause damage because their tactical framework assigns zero value to avoiding it when avoiding it is not mission necessary. Brutality has passion in it. The Carcharodons' destruction is impersonal in a way that is somehow more alarming because there is no appeal available to the impersonal. You cannot reason with it, cannot placate it, cannot redirect it through arguments about mercy or honor or the rules that govern acceptable conduct among civilized beings. It will do what the mission requires and nothing else. And if what the mission requires is the destruction of everything you value, then that is what will happen. Part 13. Why the Carcharodons are the most feared chapter. There are chapters in the Imperium that are more powerful in raw terms. The first founding chapters, the Ultramarines, the Blood Angels, the Space Wolves, the Imperial Fists have longer histories, larger war records, more storied individual campaigns, and in several cases, genetic heritages that confer specific advantages the Carcharodons do not share. There are chapters whose founding Primarchs were among the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever seen, whose spiritual and tactical inheritance from those Primarchs gives them capabilities and insights unavailable to successors. The Carcharodons are not the most powerful Space Marine chapter in any objectively measurable sense. What they are is something different. They are the most frightening. Fear is not the same thing as respect for power, and it is not the same thing as the cold threat assessment that experienced warriors apply to dangerous opponents. Fear is specific. It lives in the gap between what you can predict and what you cannot, in the space where your threat models break down, because the thing you are facing does not operate by the rules. Your threat models are built to address. The Carcharodons generate fear because they are systematically unpredictable in ways that even very experienced military minds struggle to manage. They appear without warning. This is not a matter of operational stealth, though they practice operational stealth expertly. It is a matter of fundamental absence from the normal information systems by which military organizations track and anticipate threats. The Carcharodons are not in the Administratum's records in any meaningful way. You cannot track their movements through the astropathic networks because they do not use astropathic communication. You cannot correlate their presence with known deployment schedules because they have no deployment schedules visible to outside observers. They simply arrive, and by the time they arrive, it is too late to prepare for their arrival in any meaningful sense. Their silence in combat is another source of fear, distinct from the fear their capabilities inspire. Human beings and space marines are not quite human, but are human enough for this to apply process, threat partially through the sounds threats make. An enemy that makes noise is an enemy that can be tracked, anticipated, responded to through the auditory information their activity provides. The Carcharodons make no noise. They advance in silence, fight in silence, kill in silence, and withdraw in silence. And the cognitive dissonance of watching space marines in heavy armor move through a combat environment without producing any sound at all creates a particular variety of horror in observers that the noise of conventional battle cannot replicate. It is the horror of the shark below the surface. You cannot hear it coming, and when it arrives, the encounter is already in its final phase. The chapter's physical appearance amplifies this effect. The pale, death-colored skin, the absolute black eyes without any normal ocular feature, the denticle-covered skin of the older warriors. The bodies that have been modified by 10,000 years of void adaptation into shapes that are recognizably Astartes, but carry enough biological deviation to register as something that has spent too long in an environment that fundamentally does not support life. These are the physical markings of something that came from the darkness. And whatever psychological associations the human mind builds around darkness, the deep water, the unlit space beneath the surface, the void between stars, the Carcharodons, wear those associations in their skin. Their loyalty, which is genuine and absolute, does not reduce the fear that their presence generates. And this is perhaps the most philosophically interesting thing about them. They are loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium. They are not going to destroy you because they have been corrupted by chaos, or because they have decided the Imperium is not worth serving. They are going to do whatever the mission requires. And if the mission requires your destruction, the fact that you are a loyal Imperial servant is not sufficient protection. The Mantis warriors were loyal. The Carcharodons destroyed them anyway because the Mantis warriors had made choices that placed them in opposition to the chapter's mission. And the Edicts of Exile do not contain a provision that says loyalty exempts you from the consequences of operational necessity. This is what separates the fear the Carcharodons generate from the fear generated by Chaos forces or Xenos. Chaos and Xenos are external threats, outside the Imperium, understandable in the framework of an institution that has spent 10,000 years cataloging external threats and developing responses to them. The Carcharodons are inside the Imperium. They bear the Emperor's mark. They operate with Imperial sanction, confirmed at the level of the High Lords of Terra. And they will burn your world if the mission requires it, or take your children if the tithe demands it. And the Inquisition's sealed files will note that this happened and it will not matter, because the Carcharodons have been doing this for 10,000 years with full authorization, and the fact that you find it monstrous does not change the fact that the authority structure of the Imperium has decided this is acceptable. That is the deepest source of the fear they generate. It is not just fear of what they can do. It is the recognition in the people who understand enough about them to really think about it, that what they can do has been sanctioned, that the civilization you live within has decided that your protection from these things is conditional and limited, that somewhere beyond the edge of what is mapped and known, gray ships move in darkness, and they are yours, and they are coming. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are many things that hunt humanity. Daemons from the warp, tyrannids from beyond the galaxy's edge, ancient machine intelligences that have been waiting for cycles of time that make human history seem trivial. Against all of these, the Imperium deploys its guardians, the Space Marines, the Great Chapters, the sons of Primarchs who have been remade into something post-human and pointed at the darkness that presses in from every direction. The Carcharodons are pointed at all of it, and the darkness, at least in the outer reaches where they have hunted for 10,000 years, knows better than to come close. Part 9. The Ashen Claws Brothers Across the Void. The relationship between the Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws is one of the most fascinating and psychologically layered dynamics in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and it rewards examination precisely because it is not a simple alliance, not a simple rivalry, and not a simple hatred. It is all three of those things simultaneously, compressed into a trade relationship that has been sustained across millennia because both parties have no better option available to them, and both parties know it. The Ashen Claws began their existence as the 18th chapter of the Raven Guard Legion during the Great Crusade. Terran-born, like many early Legion warriors, they had been shaped by old Terra's wars long before Corvus Corax was found and reunited with his legion. They were dispatched on a crusade into the outer reaches, into regions of the galaxy where the crusade's reach was thin and the need for warriors who could operate without close supervision from the Legion command was correspondingly greater. They operated there for years, building their own internal culture at a significant remove from whatever Corax was doing to reshape the Raven Guard closer to the Crusade's core territories. When the Horus Heresy began, when the news reached them of what was happening across the galaxy, the betrayal at Istvan III, the massacre at Istvan V, where Corax and the Raven Guard were nearly destroyed by the Sons of Horus and the traitors, the 18th chapter made a choice that defies the binary framework. Most histories apply to that conflict. They declared for neither side. Not Horus, whose treachery they found repugnant, not the Emperor, whose institutions had long since ceased to command the personal loyalty their founders had once felt. They looked at a galaxy consuming itself in a war between two beings who each claimed absolute authority, and they chose the only third option available, themselves. This was not nihilism. What followed made that clear. The Ashen Claws turned the considerable military capacity they had accumulated during their crusade against the Night Lords, attacking the Nostromo sector, the Night Lords' home territory, with a ferocity that carried unmistakable ideological content. These were warriors who had spent time in the Outer Dark long enough to develop their own moral code, and that code found the Night Lords' particular brand of institutionalized cruelty specifically offensive. They sacked Tenebor, the fortress moon of Nostromo itself. They killed the Night Lords, stationed on Cairn, and sealed the civilian population beneath collapsed spire cities. They systematically destabilized the Night Lords' hold over their home sector, stripping fortresses and supply caches and critically harvesting progenoid glands from the fallen Night Lords for their own biological purposes. That last detail is worth sitting with. The Ashen Claws were taking Night Lords' gene seed. In the conditions of the Horus Heresy, with the Raven Guard's formal supply chain to the Adeptus Mechanicus disrupted by the war, and with the 18th chapter operating entirely independently in regions the Imperium had effectively abandoned, harvesting gene seed from available sources was a matter of survival. You could not be fastidious about genetic purity if being fastidious meant your chapter dying out entirely. The Night Lord's gene seed was available, in quantity, from warriors you were already killing for other reasons. The calculation was pragmatic and grim, and entirely characteristic of a chapter that had already made the decision to prioritize its own continuity over institutional approval. And this is where the connection to the Carcharodons becomes most interesting. The Carcharodons, who are themselves operating in the Outer Dark, with similarly constrained access to the Mechanicus's gene seed services, who are similarly dependent on whatever biological material they can obtain through their own means and their own relationships, almost certainly drew on the same pool of available material during the founding period. The gene seed markers that Deathwatch apothecaries found in recovered Carcharodon samples, primarily Raven Guard, but with anomalies that do not fit the Raven Guard template, suggest exactly this kind of pragmatic genetic mixture, the same survival arithmetic that led the Ashen Claws to harvest from the Night Lords applied to the Carcharodons' founding circumstances. The Ashen Claws know this. That is why they call the Carcharodons mongrels and traitor-born. They are not using these terms purely as insults. They are making a biological observation from direct knowledge of their own history and the overlapping circumstances that produced both chapters. When they say the Carcharodons carry contamination, they mean specifically that the Night Lord's gene seed, the gene seed that the Ashen Claws themselves harvested during the heresy, found its way into the Carcharodons' founding bloodline. Whether the Ashen Claws helped put it there, whether they sold it to whoever was building the Carcharodons at the time as part of an early version of the relationship the two chapters maintain today, or whether it arrived by some other route, is not confirmed in the lore. But the Ashen Claws clearly believe they know what is in the Carcharodons' gene pool, and their contempt is specifically calibrated to that knowledge. By the 41st millennium, the Ashen Claws are in real difficulty. According to Robbie McNiven's Outer Dark novel, they have settled on a world called Atargatis Prime, beyond the Ghoul Stars region, and their numbers are declining in ways they are struggling to reverse. A renegade chapter with no official status in the Imperium, hunted by anyone who discovers their existence. Without access to the Mechanicus's formal gene seed production services, or the supply chains that sustain other chapters, they have been sustaining themselves for 10,000 years on their own resources and their own relationships, and those resources and relationships are reaching their limits. Their chapter master, Nehat Nev, leads a force that is in decline and that knows it is in decline, which adds a particular bitterness to every interaction with the Carcharodons, who by comparison appear to be surviving their similar circumstances considerably better. The meetings between the two chapters at Atargatis Prime are extraordinary events by any standard. Two chapters that most of the Imperium does not know exist, meeting on a world beyond the edge of known space, to trade resources under conditions of mutual suspicion and barely managed hostility. The Ashen Claw's leader attempts to dominate the negotiations, testing the Carcharodons' representatives with provocations and games of precedence designed to establish psychological advantage before the actual exchange begins. The Carcharodons' representatives respond with the particular quality of disengaged patience that characterizes everything about them. They are not interested in the psychological game, they are interested in the transaction, and the disconnect between what the Ashen Claws are trying to accomplish and what the Carcharodons are actually paying attention to is itself a kind of dominance. It was during one such meeting that the confrontation between Tyberos and Nehat Nev occurred. The specific provocation that led to the challenge is not fully documented, but the outcome is, Tyberos issued a challenge, the duel happened, and Tyberos won. He took Hunger and Slake from Nev's defeated hands, carried them back to his own chapter, and has worn them in every significant engagement since. The weapons have become so associated with Tyberos personally that most observers do not know they originated with the Ashen Claws, which is probably exactly how the Red Wake prefers it. The Ashen Claw's ongoing fury about this is one of the most enduring and quietly satisfying pieces of Carcharodon's lore, because it reveals something true about Tyberos. He does not pick fights he cannot win, but he finds provocations he cannot ignore an invitation rather than a risk. When the Tyranid threat made cooperation necessary, something interesting happened. The Ashen Claws, fighting alongside the Carcharodons against Hive Fleet elements in the Outer Dark, were described in Outer Dark as revitalized by the experience. They had been declining, numerically and psychologically, under the weight of their isolation and the slow attrition of years without a worthy enough opponent to sharpen themselves against. The Tyranids are a worthy opponent in exactly the terms that a warrior chapter values: powerful, relentless, dangerous in close combat, not susceptible to the psychological approaches that work against enemies who experience fear. Against the Tyranids, you fight or you die, and that clarifying simplicity gave the Ashen Claws something they had been missing. The Carcharodons noticed. They registered their appreciation in the specific way they register everything by continuing the relationship, by showing up again, by allowing the trade to persist through the difficult aftermath of a confrontation that should, in principle, have ended it. Mutual self-interest is a more reliable foundation for a sustained relationship than affection, in the Outer Dark as much as anywhere else. The Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws will not be friends. They were not designed to be friends, and the history between them makes friendship essentially impossible. But they will continue to meet at Atargatis Prime, continue to exchange what each chapter needs for what each chapter can provide, continue to manage the specific personal animosity that their leaders carry for each other through the formal mechanisms of trade, rather than allowing it to escalate into war. Because the alternative mutual destruction in the Outer Dark, far from any witness, two chapters dissolving each other in a conflict that accomplishes nothing for the mission that sent them both into the dark in the first place, serves neither chapter's purpose. And in the Outer Dark, purpose is everything. Part 10. War in the Deeps, the Tyranid Campaigns. As the 41st millennium ground toward its catastrophic conclusion and the Tyranid hive fleets began making their approach toward the galaxy's inhabited regions, The Carcharodons found themselves in the path of the largest biological threat the Imperium had ever faced. The Outer Dark, which had been their territory for 10,000 years, was now also the approach vector for something that consumed entire worlds, the way ordinary predators consume individual prey, not selectively, not surgically, but completely, leaving nothing behind but bare rock and the faint chemical memory of what had lived there. The Tyranids are unlike any other enemy the chapter had encountered in 10 millennia of service. You cannot demoralize them. You cannot exploit their chain of command, because their chain of command runs directly through the hive mind and cannot be severed by killing individual organisms, the way you can disrupt a human military force by targeting its leadership. You cannot make them afraid, cannot threaten them with consequences, cannot reason with them, or appeal to any interest they might have in survival or self-preservation. They have no individual survival instinct in the conventional sense. Individual organisms are expendable tools of the collective, as replaceable as bolter shells, and about as interested in continuing to exist as bolter shells are. They respond to material destruction only, and their capacity to absorb material destruction is effectively limitless, because the biomass they lose in any given engagement feeds directly into the production of replacement organisms for the next one. Fighting a Tyranid hive fleet is, at a strategic level, fighting the ocean. You can hold back a wave. You cannot hold back the water. The chapter adapted to this reality with the pragmatism that characterizes everything about how they operate. Their void-boarding tactics, the ancient harpoon lance systems that the Carcharodons derived from World Eater Legion techniques during the Great Crusade, the massive chains that drag impaled vessels toward the hunters, the sudden intimacy of two ships joined by metal tethers while Astartes pour through the breach, worked against Tyranid bioships with the specific effectiveness of techniques designed for exactly this kind of engagement. A Tyranid hive ship is a more difficult target in some respects than a conventional warship, because it is alive in ways that make damage assessment complicated, and because its biological structure regenerates in ways that metal hulls do not. But a hive ship impaled by a Carcharodon's boarding harpoon is also a hive ship that cannot maneuver, cannot escape, and is about to receive an assault force specifically trained for close quarters killing in confined, hostile biological environments. The Carcharodons had been operating in the Outer Dark long enough to have encountered Xenos threats that the Imperium's intelligence organizations had never catalogued. 10,000 years of patrols beyond the galaxy's edge had given them experience with biological threats that predated Tyranids in the local region, creatures and entities from the darkness between galaxies, whose specific danger signatures had been memorized and documented in the chapter's oral tradition. When the hive fleets began pushing through their operational territory, the chapter had a baseline of experience with large-scale biological threats that gave them a tactical starting point. Most Imperial commanders were working to develop from zero. The campaign described in McNiven's Outer Dark places Baal Shar and the Third Company on Piety V, a shrine world in the path of an incoming Tyranid advance, with orders to make the world a bulwark, a hard stop that bleeds the hive fleet's forward elements enough to slow the advance and give the broader Imperial response time to organize. Shar's approach to this assignment is entirely Carcharodons. Assess the world's existing defenses, identify the points of maximum leverage, commit his limited forces to the positions where they will produce the greatest return on investment in enemy organisms, destroyed per Carcharodon deployed, and hold those positions until the tactical calculus shifts. Personal feeling does not enter the operational planning. Piety V complicates this. It is a shrine world, meaning its civilian population is vast and present, and not organized for the kind of rapid military mobilization that a Tyranid assault requires. The population is mostly pilgrims, religious administrators, and the support staff of a world whose primary industry is faith. These are not people who will fight effectively, even with Astartes' support and direction. They are liabilities, in purely tactical terms, bodies that need protecting, that consume logistical resources, that make the chapter's preferred strategy of abandoning indefensible positions and concentrating force at choke points significantly harder to execute. Shar's evolution across the campaign, his gradual, reluctant, deeply uncomfortable recognition that the people of Piety V are not simply a liability variable in a tactical equation, is the emotional heart of Outer Dark. He was himself taken in a tithe. He was himself, at some earlier point in his existence, the kind of person his chapter now treats as a renewable resource to be harvested and processed into warriors or serfs. He has accepted what the Carcharodons made of him, accepted the stripping of his original identity and the construction of a new one in the chapter's image. But acceptance is not the same as the absence of memory, and watching specific individuals face the specific, consuming horror of a Tyranid assault creates a form of recognition that the chapter's conditioning cannot entirely suppress. The Tyranids that arrived at Piety V were not a full hive fleet. They were splinter elements, advanced formations ahead of the main body, but still vastly more numerous and biologically diverse than anything the Third Company could hold against indefinitely. The battles through Piety V's cathedral districts and shrine complexes, enormous, elaborate architectural spaces built to inspire awe in their scale, now serving as defensive positions for Carcharodons Astartes, and the frightened civilians sheltering behind them, produced exactly the kind of close quarters, room by room, corridor by corridor fighting that the chapter excels at. The Tyranids sent everything they had. Swarms of smaller organisms probed defenses and identified weaknesses. Larger bioconstructs broke through where the probes found gaps. The hive mind adapted its approach in real time, and the Carcharodons adapted back, and the result was a campaign of grinding, escalating attrition that tested the chapter in ways that single, decisive engagements do not. The arrival of the Ashen Claws at a critical moment of the Piety V campaign introduced one of the most charged moments in the available Carcharodons fiction. Nihat Nev's chapter arrived in force, offering military support in exchange for terms that included the retrieval of a specific individual, a world eater, a surviving remnant of a cornate warband that the Ashen Claws had some prior interest in. The nature of that interest, and Nev's pointed characterization of the World Eater as a brother of the Carcharodons, laid the chapter's accusations about genetic heritage in front of Shar in the most direct way possible. Whether Shar chose to process that information as meaningful, whether the chimeric gene seed accusation registered as something requiring a response, or simply as another piece of Nev's ongoing psychological warfare, the moment is constructed to make the question unavoidable for the pace reader. Tyberos appears at the campaign's conclusion in the form you would expect from everything the lore establishes about him, arriving at the moment of maximum stakes, operating with casual devastation against the largest threats available, and projecting the particular quality of absolute capability that makes witnesses describe encounters with him as experiences rather than observations. 3 Tyranid warriors, large, fast, ferociously dangerous bioconstructs are dispatched in seconds before Tyberos boards a Tyranid organism and eliminates everything inside it with what the narration conveys as something approaching routine efficiency. He is the apex predator's apex predator, the thing at the top of the food chain in an environment where being at the top of the food chain is genuinely not easy. The longer-term biological legacy of the Tyranid campaigns shows in the Carcharodons veterans who survived them. The dentical growths that already distinguish older Carcharodons from their younger counterparts are accelerated by extended contact with Tyranid biological material. Warriors who board bioships repeatedly, who spend hours fighting in the dripping, enzymatically hostile interior of living vessels, accumulate biological markers that are genuinely difficult to separate from the normal aging process of their gene seed's expression in a void-adapted body. The chapter carries the evidence of every extended campaign in its members' skin, and the Tyranid Wars added a dimension to that biological record that the existing mutations of the gene seed alone could not produce. Part 11. The Niker and the Grey Fleet. The Carcharodons' fleet is their world, their fortress, their home, and their identity, and no single vessel in that fleet is more central to all 4 of those things than the Nicor. This ancient battle barge is the chapter's flagship, the seat of Tyberos' command, the mobile fortress monastery from which the chapter's campaigns are directed and to which its warriors return between operations. Understanding the Nicor is, in a meaningful sense, understanding what it means to be a Carcharodon. The records that give us any information about the Nicor at all come from a somewhat unlikely source, a group of archivist scholars employed by Battlefleet Pacificus who were studying ancient records in the Segmentum Pacificus, fleet base of Hydrafer, in 703 of the 40th millennium, roughly 300 years before the Badab War. These scholars were not looking for the Necron specifically. They were conducting general archival research into ancient fleet records, and the Necron's deck plans surfaced in that research in ways that allowed preliminary identification of the vessel. Their assessment identified the Necron as a heavily modified Charybdis-class Grand Cruiser, a warship pattern produced during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy eras. If any sister ships of this class still exist anywhere in the Imperium, they have not been documented. The class was rare, even at its production peak, and has not been built for 10,000 years. The word modified deserves significant emphasis here. The Necron that the archivist scholars were reconstructing from ancient deck plans was already a vessel that had been through several generations of substantial modification from whatever the Charybdis-class baseline was. The modifications layered over the original design would themselves have been centuries old by the time those scholars were examining the records. By the time of the Badab War, the Necron had been in continuous service and continuous modification for, at minimum, 10,000 years, each generation of tech marines adding to, adapting, and repairing a vessel that had accumulated its history in the same layered way that a Carcharodons veteran accumulates exile markings one generation at a time, each edition building on what came before, the whole representing something that cannot be properly understood without understanding all the history that produced it. The Necron is described by those who encountered it during the Badab War as slightly smaller than a standard Astartes battle barge, but both swift and lethal, qualities that do not typically coexist in vessels of that mass, but that are characteristic of the Carcharodons' general operational philosophy. Speed is life in the outer dark, and a vessel that sacrifices mobility for size is a vessel that can be caught, which is exactly the kind of vulnerability the chapter's existence does not permit. The ship's overall design aesthetic, as much as can be reconstructed from the partial information available, suggests a vessel that has been optimized and re-optimized over millennia for exactly the kind of operations the Carcharodons specialize in: void predation, surprise boarding actions, rapid approach and departure, the hunting pattern of a creature that must kill efficiently and move constantly. The harpoon lance systems that define the chapter's signature void tactic were installed on the Necron and its accompanying vessels at some point in the chapter's history, the exact timing unknown. These are not weapons that appear in any standard Mechanicus catalog. They are enormous, mounted on the ship's hull in configurations that the standard armory would not recognize, designed to fire massive lance projectiles deep into enemy hulls, at ranges that are technically extreme for weapons of their type, then winch the impaled vessel toward the Necron on massive chains. The technique, as noted in Imperial records, was developed originally by the World Eaters Legion as a void warfare approach, and the fact that the Carcharodons adopted and maintained it for 10,000 years, while the World Eaters themselves evolved their tactics in very different directions, reflects both the chapter's particular genius for finding the Didgeons optimal tool for their mission and their complete indifference to whether that tool originated with a legion that most of the Imperium would prefer not to acknowledge. The rest of the fleet, the warships that accompany the Necron on its endless patrol, the strike cruisers and escorts and transports that sustain the chapter's operations across the outer dark, is not documented in any Imperial source with any reliability. The chapter does not file fleet composition reports. No surveillance asset has successfully followed Carcharodons' vessels long enough to produce a comprehensive accounting. What is known is that the fleet is sufficient for sustained independent operations across some of the most demanding operational environments in the galaxy, which implies a composition capable of both independent strike capability and logistical self-sufficiency, but the specific vessels, their classes, their names, and their current disposition are simply unknown. The cryo-tank bays within the Necron and its companion vessels represent one of the most important architectural features of the entire chapter's existence, more in their psychological than their physical significance. Every Space Marine chapter has accommodation for its warriors during transit. The Carcharodons' cryo facilities are not transit accommodation in any conventional sense. They are the place where significant portions of the chapter's life actually happen, or, more precisely, do not happen, the suspended animation of warriors whose bodies are preserved through the unimaginable distances of the Outer Dark's crossing. The cumulative time that an individual Carcharodon spends in cryo across their service could constitute decades or centuries of suspended existence, time that was not experienced but was nonetheless consumed, emerging on the other side with the same body, somewhat older, with the galaxy changed by whatever events occurred during the crossing, and the specific darkness of the Outer Dark unchanged entirely. This creates a temporal distortion in the chapter's experience of history that has no parallel in the Astartes tradition. A Carcharodon warrior of moderate seniority might have personal memories spanning centuries of time elapsed, but only decades of time experienced, with the gaps filled in by briefing and report rather than living knowledge. The disconnect between the objective timeline of Imperial history and the subjective timeline of individual Carcharodon service is something the chapter has had to develop specific cultural tools to manage, because a warrior who emerges from cryo and finds that 200 years of history have happened without them is a warrior who needs to rapidly reconstruct a working understanding of the current situation from fragmentary information without the benefit of the gradual contextual accumulation that living through those years would have provided. The Tech Marines who maintain the Necron are among the most specialized practitioners of their craft in the entire Astartes tradition. To keep a 10,000-year-old vessel operational, without access to the standard Mechanicus supply chains, without the ability to commission replacement components from established forge worlds, without the formal institutional support that most Tech Marines can draw on, this requires a depth of practical engineering knowledge combined with improvisational capability that goes significantly beyond the standard Martian training. The Carcharodon's Tech Marines have had to develop expertise in maintaining systems that the Mechanicus would not know how to repair even with access to the original schematics, because the systems on the Necron have been modified so many times by previous generations that the original schematics are no longer fully relevant to what actually exists inside the ship's hull. Part 12. The blindness when the shark becomes the darkness. The gene seed madness that the Carcharodons call the blindness is one of the most revealing things about the chapter. Not because it is shameful, the chapter does not treat it as shameful. Exactly. But because of what it implies about the genetic tensions at the heart of the Carcharodons' identity. It is what happens when the darkness wins. Not the external darkness of the void, not the strategic darkness of the chapter's operational methods, but the internal darkness that the chapter's entire culture exists to contain. The blindness manifests as an extreme, uncontrollable aggression that progressively erodes the warrior's ability to distinguish between friend and enemy. In its early stages, it presents as intensified combat effectiveness. The warrior becomes faster, more decisive, more relentlessly effective in close quarters fighting, the kind of performance enhancement that might, in another context, be celebrated. But the escalation does not stop at peak effectiveness. It continues past it, into territory where the warrior begins responding to the mere presence of other living things as a combat stimulus, where the triggers that should direct the aggression outward toward enemies begin misfiring toward any available target, and where the warrior's capacity for tactical assessment, the cold, controlled channeling of violence that the chapter prizes above raw ferocity, deteriorates into something that can no longer be trusted around anyone, ally or enemy. This is the Void Exile. The warrior who reaches this point is not executed. The chapter does not waste capabilities, and a Space Marine in the grip of the blindness is, in purely material terms, an extraordinarily dangerous weapon. He is stripped of rank, title, and name. The exile markings he has earned are not removed, because the history they represent was real and cannot be unmade, but no new ones will be added. He is given a ship, supplies, and a mission, typically a mission into the most hostile environment the chapter has identified in its operational territory, a mission where the warrior's particular kind of broken is useful, and where his death, when it comes, will have accomplished something. He is sent alone into the dark, and the chapter does not expect to hear from him again. The theological framing of the blindness within Carcharodon's culture connects directly to the concept of the maw, the darkness as a consuming principle, the void as something that can take you if you allow the boundary between yourself and it to dissolve entirely. The warrior who succumbs to the blindness is understood to have been taken by what surrounds them, to have allowed the mask to become the face. The great Carcharodon the shark is a shape they wear in battle, an embodiment of predatory purpose that makes them effective. But beneath the mask, there is supposed to remain a person, or at least something that was once a person, something that remembers why it is doing what it is doing, and can stop doing it when the battle is over. The warrior the blindness claims can no longer stop, and in the Carcharodons' understanding, that is not becoming more of what they are supposed to be. It is becoming less, losing the discipline and purpose that distinguish the hunter from the simple beast, the predatory intelligence from the purely predatory instinct. Given the chimeric gene seed theory, the blindness takes on additional implications. If the Carcharodons carry Night Lord's genetic material alongside their Raven Guard heritage, the particular quality of aggressive instinct that the Night Lord's gene seed produced in its carriers, the darkness-born fury, the attraction to violence for its own sake, the erosion of restraint that characterized the Night Lord's degeneration, would represent a source of internal pressure that the Raven Guard elements of the heritage must continuously work against. The chapter's culture of ego suppression, of collectivism over individual identity, of void vows and exile markings, and the deliberate stripping of personal history from new recruits. All of these practices could be understood as technologies developed specifically to manage the pressure of a genetic heritage that, if left unchecked, trends toward the blindness. The culture is not merely tradition, it is medicine. Part 13, The Forgotten One, the mystery that defines everything. It is worth spending time on the Forgotten One specifically, because this figure is the axis around which the entire Carcharodon's identity rotates, and the nature of this figure as an absence, as a defined unknown, rather than a known quantity, is itself philosophically meaningful in ways that have no equivalent in other chapter mythologies. Most Space Marine chapters know their Primarch. They have extensive records of who that person was, what they taught, what they believed, how they fought, what they looked like, the specific quality of their voice and their presence and their command. These are not abstractions. For chapters whose Primarchs lived and died within the historical period and left substantial records, the Primarch is a richly documented ancestor whose specific characteristics can be studied and emulated with some degree of confidence that the emulation resembles the original. The Carcharodons cannot do any of this. They do not know with certainty who the Forgotten One was. They believe he was the first among them, the one who gave the exile its form and its meaning, the one who received the mandate from the Void Father and passed it down. But his specific identity, if it was Arcus Fowl, if it was someone else, if the Shade Lord title connects the first Carcharodon chapter master directly to the pre-Corax Raven Guard Legion, is not preserved in any accessible form. 10,000 years of oral transmission has dissolved the specifics into the shapes of myth, leaving only the outline of a story whose central character has no face. What the Forgotten One left behind is the Edicts of Exile, and those edicts are specific, detailed, and fully operational. They govern the chapter's relationship with the Imperium. They define when the chapter may enter known space, and for what purposes. They establish the conditions under which the chapter may conduct the red tithes and the gray tithes, and whatever other resource-gathering activities the edicts permit. They contain the promise that the exile is not permanent, that when the Void Father walks again among mortals, the chapter may return home. These are not vague spiritual guidelines. They are institutional law, precise enough to generate consistent chapter behavior across 10,000 years of application in conditions that the original author could not possibly have anticipated in their specifics. This creates an interesting paradox. The Forgotten One, whose personal identity has been lost, whose name cannot be spoken because it has not been preserved, is simultaneously the most influential individual in the chapter's existence. Everything the Carcharodons are, everything they do, every decision they make about when to enter Imperial space and when to withdraw, and what they may take and what they must leave, all of it traces back to a set of laws issued by a person the chapter can no longer identify. He is present in their every action and absent from their every memory. The founding figure who defined their purpose is the one thing about their own history they cannot access. There is something genuinely poignant about this, that the chapter's stoic exterior does not immediately suggest. Imagine carrying a set of instructions from someone you loved and respected, instructions that have shaped your entire life, that have determined every significant choice you have made, and not being able to remember who gave them to you. Not because the instructions became less meaningful, but because 10,000 years of trying to preserve the memory without the tools that preservation requires finally exhausted the memory itself, leaving the instructions standing and the instructor gone. The Carcharodons have not resolved this. They have accepted it, which is a different thing. The forgotten one is forgotten, and the chapter has made the forgetting itself part of its identity, a reminder that what matters is not the person who issued the mandate, but the mandate itself, not the voice that spoke the purpose, but the purpose that was spoken. Whether this acceptance is wisdom or resignation, whether there is grief underneath it that the chapter's culture successfully suppresses, or whether the suppression has been so complete that the grief itself no longer exists, these are questions the lore leaves unanswered, and probably deliberately so. Some of the Carcharodons' most important aspects are defined by what we are not permitted to know about them. Part 14. The Edicts of Exile Law from the Outer Dark. The Edicts of Exile are the Carcharodons' foundational legal and institutional framework, the set of rules that govern the chapter's relationship with the Imperium it serves, and the conditions under which that service is rendered. They are, in a very practical sense, the only thing standing between the chapter's activities and a formal imperial declaration of renegade status, because several of the things the chapter does would be clearly illegal under normal imperial law, without the specific authorization the edicts provide. The right to conduct red tithes to descend on imperial worlds, take their young men through a brutal selection process, conscript additional population as chapter serfs, and depart without formal permission from the planetary governor or the sector administration, is not something the Imperium normally permits any organization to exercise over its civilian populations. Space Marine chapters recruit from specific worlds under arrangements that the Administratum recognizes and that the affected worlds have, in some formal or traditional sense, agreed to. What the Carcharodons do is something significantly more abrupt than that. They arrive without notice, take what they need, and leave. The only thing that makes this legal rather than piracy is the Edicts of Exile, which provide blanket authorization for this activity and which, crucially, have been confirmed at a level of the imperial hierarchy that no sector governor or inquisitor, short of the very senior grades, can overturn. The nature of this imperial endorsement is itself significant. The Edicts of Exile are not a standing order from the current Administratum. They are a 10,000-year-old document issued at the founding of the chapter and confirmed by authorities that no longer exist in their original form, citing a mandate that connects to a period of imperial history so ancient that most of the institutional infrastructure that existed when the edicts were written has been replaced, reorganized, destroyed, and rebuilt multiple times since. The fact that the edicts are still honored, that the inquisitorial records treat them as valid authorization, and that the Carcharodons have not been formally declared renegade, despite conducting activities that would definitely generate that declaration from any chapter without similar. Authorization suggests that someone at a very high level of the imperial hierarchy is maintaining the validity of these documents and protecting them from the bureaucratic obsolescence that would otherwise have rendered them meaningless centuries ago. Who that someone is, and what their interest in the Carcharodons' continued operation represents, is not a question the available lore answers directly. The High Lords of Terra, who have used the Carcharodons as executors before in the Pentarchy of Blood, have obvious reasons to maintain an arm that can be extended into the outer dark without formal acknowledgement. The Inquisition's most senior elements, who have sealed records about the chapter going back to the Astropath Wars, might have institutional reasons to preserve an asset that operates where inquisitorial reach does not normally extend. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result is that the Carcharodons operate with a degree of authorization that most chapters do not have, exercising rights over imperial populations that most chapters would not be permitted to exercise, protected from the consequences of that exercise by documents too old and too well protected to be easily challenged. The edicts also specify, at least in the chapter's own reading of them, the conditions under which the chapter may take sides in Imperial conflicts. The Badab War is the clearest example. The Carcharodons entered that conflict on the Loyalist side, not because they were summoned by the Loyalist command, or because the sector administration requested their assistance, but because their own assessment of the conflict determined that one side represented the legitimate authority of the Void Father's Imperium, and the other side had rejected that authority. The edicts apparently grant the chapter discretion to make this determination independently, which is how they can arrive without invitation, align with the Loyalists without formally being absorbed into the Loyalist command structure, and pursue their own tactical agenda within the overall conflict, without being accountable to the Loyalist command for the specific methods they employ. This independence is simultaneously the chapter's greatest operational asset, and the thing about them that other Astartes commanders find most difficult to work with. During the Badab War, the nominal Loyalist commander received whatever level of Carcharodons' cooperation served the chapter's mission assessment, and received cold, polite non-engagement when it did not, and there was nothing he could do about this, because the Carcharodons' mandate did not derive from his authority. The chapter answered to the edicts, not to him, and the edicts predated and outranked anything he could invoke. Managing a battle in which one of your most powerful assets is entirely outside your actual command authority is a specific kind of challenge that the Badab War's Loyalist commanders had to solve on the fly, and their solutions were necessarily imperfect. Part 15. What it means to meet the Carcharodons. Everything that has been covered in this video has been approaching from the outside. The history, the genetics, the theology, the combat doctrine, the major campaigns. But there is a quality of the Carcharodons' experience that can only be understood by attempting to reconstruct what it would actually be like to encounter them, not as a scholar studying their lore from a distance, but as a person in their presence. Imagine you are the governor of a feral world, in a region of space that is not frequently patrolled, not strategically significant in any way the sector administration would notice. Your world is primitive by the standards of the Imperium. Your people are tough, hard-bitten survivors in the literal sense. Your world's conditions select for exactly the kind of physical and psychological durability that makes good Astartes aspirants. You have heard of Space Marines. Everyone has heard of Space Marines, even on a feral world far from the Administratum's attention. They are the god warriors of the Emperor, post-human defenders of humanity, beings of such extraordinary capability that their presence on a battlefield is understood to be decisive. And then one morning, before anyone was watching the right part of the sky, the ships appear. Dark ships, big ships, running without lights, without identification, without any of the signals that Imperial vessels normally broadcast to announce themselves and establish their intentions. Your orbital defense systems, such as they are, detect them too late to mount any organized response. And before the response could be organized anyway, the drop pods have already deployed, and gray armored giants are walking through your settlement, and every instinct your people have developed from lives lived in genuinely dangerous environments is screaming that whatever these things want, you should give it to them. They do not speak to you immediately. They do not explain themselves or issue demands or follow any of the protocols that your limited experience with Imperial representatives has led you to expect from official visitors. They move through your settlement with that specific quality of absolute purposefulness, not hurrying, because hurrying implies uncertainty about the outcome. And these things are not uncertain about anything. Looking at your people with those solid black eyes that give back nothing, assessing everyone they see with criteria you cannot identify and would not understand if you could. When they do speak, one of them tells you precisely what is going to happen. They will take some of your young men, the strongest, the hardest, the ones who survive what comes next. They will take more of your people as workers for their ships. They are leaving you one person, afterward, who will be able to tell others what happened. This is not a negotiation. They are not asking for your permission, or your cooperation, or your understanding. They are informing you of what will occur and giving you the opportunity to choose whether it will occur with or without additional violence. And you cooperate because you are not a fool, and you are not a hero, and the specific combination of the black eyes, and the silence, and the ancient armor, and the weight of 10,000 years of demonstrated capability, pressing down on every interaction they have with anyone, all of that communicates, more clearly than any explicit threat, that the only choice you actually have is whether your world ends this conversation with its infrastructure intact or does not. Afterward, when the gray ships have gone as silently as they came, there is the question of what you tell people. You can say, Space Marines came. You can say they took people. But the specific quality of what you experienced, the silence, the absolute absence of any emotion directed at you or your people, the sense that you were assessed by something that saw you clearly and found you neither threatening nor interesting, only useful, that quality is very difficult to describe in terms that communicate its actual texture to someone who was not there. One survivor. That is what the Carcharodons leave behind. One person, specifically chosen by the chapter's departing warriors, standing in the wreckage of whatever the tithe required, with a head full of images that will not simplify into narrative for a very long time. One person whose job the chapter knew this, which is why they chose them, is to make sure other worlds know the space sharks were here and might come back. That single survivor, and the story they tell, and the fear that story generates in everyone who hears it, is the Carcharodons' most enduring and deliberately maintained resource. Reputation is power in the outer dark. The gray ship's legend is a weapon that functions continuously, even when the gray ships are 1,000 light-years away. Conclusion: the void remains, and so do they. There is a strange beauty to the Carcharodons, once you have spent enough time with their lore to move past the surface presentation of gray armor and shark imagery and silence. It is the beauty of things that have endured, beyond all reasonable expectation. A culture that found a way to remain coherent across 10,000 years of the most hostile conditions imaginable. Warriors who were sent into the dark and did not come back broken or corrupt, but came back as exactly what they were sent out to be, at enormous cost, over and over again, generation after generation, in a darkness that most people cannot begin to imagine. They are waiting, still. The Void Father has not walked again among mortals in the form that would fulfill the ancient promise their founding figures made. The Forgotten One's name has not been recovered from the mist of 10,000 years of oral transmission. The Great Rift and the receipt of Utheka have complicated their institutional situation in ways that are still working themselves out in the current narrative. But the fundamental situation, a chapter defined by its exclusion from the normal community of the Imperium's defenders, belonging to the darkness more than to the light, has not fundamentally changed. They are still what they were. Still the thing that comes from beyond the edge. Still the gray ships that run dark. Consider what they represent, taken in their full context. Every other chapter of Space Marines exists in relationship with the Imperium in some meaningful social sense. They have home worlds, or at least patron sectors. They participate in the broader community of Astartes chapters through formal and informal networks. They have allies and rivals, and the kind of institutional standing that comes from being known within a community. The Carcharodons have none of this. They are outside the community. They have been outside the community for 10,000 years, by choice and by mandate. And the outside of the community is where they have built their identity and their purpose and their reason for continuing. What makes them remarkable is not the terror they inspire. Terror is achievable if you are willing to pay the price in what you must become to generate it. What makes them remarkable is that they have spent 10,000 years paying that price and have emerged on the other side of it, still recognizably themselves, still loyal, still coherent. Still carrying the original mandate forward in conditions that would have destroyed any normal institution several times over. The culture they carry is ancient and functional. The mission they pursue is unchanged from what it was at its articulation. The faith they hold in the Void Father, in the Forgotten One, in the sacred duty that sent them into the outer dark and keeps them there, has not been corrupted by the millennia of isolation that would have shattered most human institutions beyond recovery. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the things that press in from the outer darkness are real, numerous, and hungry. The tyrannids that consumed worlds were real. The unnamed threats in the void between galaxies that the Carcharodons have been fighting for 10,000 years are real. The outer edge of the galaxy is not simply empty space waiting for someone to arrive and claim it. It is occupied, in ways that the Imperium does not fully understand, by things that the Imperium has survived only because something was out there to meet them before they reached the inhabited regions. The Carcharodons have been that something for 10,000 years, and they will be that something for 10,000 more if the Void Father's will demands it. In the dark where no one watches and no one remembers, and the silence is so absolute that it has weight, carrying out a mission that most of the people they protect do not know exists. That is the Space Sharks. That is, the Carcharodons Astra. That is what it means to be the most feared chapter in the galaxy, not because they are the most powerful, not because they have the best weapons or the most victories, but because they are the thing you meet at the edge of everything. And when you meet them there, you understand immediately that they belong to the dark in a way that you never will, and that the dark is theirs in a way that nothing else it contains can claim. The void is theirs, and whatever comes from it comes through them first. If you made it to the very end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you. Drop a comment right now, tell me where in the world you are and what time it is. Whether you are watching this at noon with the sun out or at 2 in the morning with the lights off, because this is exactly the right time for Space Sharks, I want to know. I read every single comment, and I love seeing where you all are. And if this deep dive into the Carcharodons lit something up for you, tell me in the comments what you think. Are the Space Sharks pure Raven Guard successors, carrying 10,000 years of genetic drift? Or is there something darker swimming alongside that heritage in their gene pool? The Night Lord's theory, the chimeric accusation from the Ashen Claws, the combat philosophy that looks nothing like the post-Corax Raven Guard. Where do you land on it? If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button. The Void is patient, but so is the algorithm, and the algorithm would very much appreciate the signal. See you in the next one.